Now in BBC Two, live coverage and analysis of the Chancellor of the Exchequer Kenneth Clarke's budget speech, introduced by David Dimbleby.
Good afternoon. After the excitement of last night, it's still the politics that are going to matter this afternoon for the Tory party. We saw Kenneth Clarke's rumbustious performance yesterday. Today, it's his chance through this budget to try and calm the nerves of the Tory backbenchers and to find ways of using the economy's recovery to win back, if he can, a sceptical electorate. No one's expecting tax cuts today. There are £3 billion of tax increases already in the pipeline, left over from the last budget. Cuts in married couples allowance, in mortgage interest relief, which is going to take place in April next year, and the 17.5% VAT on domestic fuel, unless he changes his mind on that one. And so you can't expect any miracle cure to produce a kind of feel-good factor today. The Chancellor's message is almost certainly going to be steady as she goes, which could make for rather a dull budget, except that within that time there are a number of things that he can do, shifting taxes one way or another. Anyway, an hour from now, or just under that, the Chancellor is going to be leaving number 11 Downing Street, his official residence in London, to go across to the House of Commons, and we'll have live coverage of the proceedings there throughout the afternoon. The Prime Minister's questions first, which is likely to be pretty lively. Remember, he sat rather silent yesterday while Kenneth Clarke did his dirty work for him. The Chancellor's budget after that, and then the reply, for the first time, from the Leader of the Opposition, Tony Blair. But away from Westminster, we're also going to be talking to people, the voters of Dudley West. They've got a by-election due in just over 2 weeks' time, and they'll be the first voters, therefore, to deliver a ballot box verdict on the Chancellor and his measures. We'll be hearing their reaction. We'll be at the RAC's new control centre in Bristol with the Motoring and Roads Lobby and the Friends of the Earth to hear their views on changes that may be made in car, road policy, petrol tax and all the rest of it. We'll be analysing what the Chancellor is up to with the BBC's economics editor, Peter Jay, himself a former Treasury Mandarin. We'll also have reaction from representatives of some employers and some members of the workforce, from the Chief Executive of Rentokil, Clive Thompson. Rentokil no longer just destroys bugs, but runs business services, and has just been voted Britain's most admired company by a number of other admired companies. And he's a worthy member of the CBI's Economics Affairs Committee. And John Monks, General Secretary of the TUC since September last year. TUC now speaks for or represents about 30% of the British workforce. On the likely impact of the budget on financial markets in the city, we'll be hearing from Gavin Davis, Chief Economist at Goldman Sachs. And on the fine detail from John Whiting, tax partner of Chartered Accountants Pricewaterhouse. And Peter Snow will be illustrating the changes and their impact on a number of typical families.
How will people in a typical British town be affected by the Chancellor's changes today? Well, we've constructed a town complete with high street shops, and we'll be illustrating the budget using this town to show how people will be affected by his indirect tax changes, his direct tax changes across a wide range of incomes, from the council flats down the end of town, right up here to the manor house where the £100,000 a year couple live.
Thanks so much, Peter. We'll now also hear Professor Tony King, Anthony King, I should call him formally, Professor of Government at Essex University, and a member of the Nolan Committee, which is looking into the sleaze allegations. He's a sort of sleaze buster. And down at Westminster, Robin Oakley, the BBC's political editor. Now, Robin, can you start by bringing us up to date on things at Westminster this afternoon? These whips have been withdrawn from 8. How long have they been withdrawn from? What kind of pickle have the government got themselves into over this issue?
Well, the government certainly have got themselves into a pickle. Suddenly, after something of a miscalculation as to how many people might actually defy what they made a confidence vote, they've turned from a government with a majority of 14 into a minority government by 2. And it will, I think, over a period, affect their ability to get legislation through the Commons. It will affect the composition of standing committees which look at legislation. Labour are already looking at what changes they might want to demand as a result of what they see as a change in the balance of power. The Tories are in a rather subdued sort of mood today. I think the shock is still sinking in. Some are very irritated with the rebels. Some are saying that John Major has used excessively strong-arm tactics. And certainly the whole question of the Tory divisions on Europe is back at the forefront of politics. I think we're going to see quite a campaign now from the Eurosceptics, a number of whom who supported the government last night actually sympathised with the rebels and went through the lobbies with a heavy heart. I think they're going to be campaigning now for a referendum on Europe, either on the outcome of the next intergovernmental conference, the so-called Maastricht II, or on the question of a single European currency.
And Robin, do you expect this whip to stay withdrawn right through the next election?
No, I don't think it will right through the next election. We'll have to see how the rebels behave. The experience of Rupert Allison, who had the whip withdrawn after rebelling on Maastricht, it was withdrawn in his case for about 15 months. And Tory whip said that actually his voting record in support of the government was a lot better after the whip was withdrawn than it had been while he was actually in receipt of the whip. This, of course, was because Mr. Allison wanted to work his passage back, which indeed he's succeeded in doing. The question is how many of the new rebels want to work their passage back, because they can't fight the next election as Tories unless the whip is restored.
Robin, let me just bring Tony King in on this. Can you think of a precedent for a Prime Minister putting himself into this kind of pickle? And can you think of a way that he can get out of it?
There are precedents for Prime Ministers putting themselves into this kind of pickle, but there aren't precedents for Prime Ministers actually succeeding. Jim Callaghan, in fact, did do something most people have forgotten back in 1976 when he actually occasioned a by-election, which the Labour Party lost and which precipitated Labour into a minority government situation. But in fact, the parallels run further than that. If one goes back to 1978-79, even before the winter of discontent, you had a government then under Jim Callaghan with no obvious sense of direction, appearing to lurch from expedient to expedient, making things up as it went along. And of course, the fate of that government is very well remembered.
And is this what you think the Prime Minister has got himself into, or is it still a matter of waiting for a day or two to see?
Well, it's very hard to say. You say waiting a day or two to see. The trouble for the government is that there is imminent crisis after crisis. There's the 17.5% VAT on fuel. There's the possibility of a leadership election being precipitated. There's, as you said, the Dudley West by-election. Further ahead, there's the Scott inquiry, and beyond that, the Intergovernmental Conference.
And there's what you're going to say on the Nolan Committee.
And there's what
about
the Nolan
sleaze in the Tory
party.
So you're a powerful figure in all this.
We're going to be very, very cross-party in that. We'll find sleaze.
Well, you have to find a few more Labour and Liberal Democrat people to talk about if you're going to be cross-party.
We can probably work at that. But it is the long term that's the real problem. It's not just the next few days.
Robin, what do you think the Prime Minister's got up his sleeve to get out of this? I mean, the 17.5% on that on fuel, for instance, which it looks as though that may be the next big parliamentary battle. They might be thinking of changing their mind on that.
No, I don't think they will change their mind on that. We've had such strong signals from Kenneth Clarke, the Chancellor, and from Jonathan Aitken, the Chief Secretary, to say that the government isn't really going to budge on that. I think the Chancellor's feeling is, firstly, that the Conservatives have been through the pain on the question of VAT on fuel, and so they might as well take the gain which they will get in revenue terms from next April. And secondly, I think they would consider it a great political climb down after the way they had to drive it through the Commons and the Finance Bill last year. But we may not actually get that new chance to vote on VAT. Some of the Labour people are a little bit nervous. The government have got some procedural stratagem up their sleeves that will stop Labour being able to raise this subject again in the course of the Finance Bill this year, because the House of Commons has already voted it through last year.
Robin, thank you very much indeed. We'll hear more about that, and we'll hear from you again later on in the programme. Thanks for joining us. We go now to Dudley, which I said was the first test, or likely to be the first test of what voters think about this budget, and indeed about the standing of the parliamentary party after yesterday's events. There's going to be a by-election there, which was caused by the death of the Conservative MP, John Blackburn. It takes place in just over a fortnight from now. Now, up in Dudley are three political leaders of the three main parties, and we'll be talking to them in just a moment. The contest in Dudley West should give a good idea of Tony Blair's ability to win over disgruntled Tory voters. Unlike other recent by-elections, this is going to be a straight fight between Labour and Tory. What Labour will be after are the votes of the home-owning skilled workers, the people who supported Mrs. Thatcher back in 1979. But they've been hit by recession, and the outlook is quite gloomy for the Tories. Labour only needs a swing of 4% to take the seat, and in the past month, they've snatched several council seats from the Tories with swings of more than 20%. Dudley is famous for its glassmakers, long-established family firms like Royal Brierley Crystal. Here too, though, the recession has bitten. company closed one factory 2 years ago, and sales have fallen by a third since 1989. It now employs about 300 people. Now, we brought 3 politicians into the glass factory. Fred Hunt, who's the Labour leader on Dudley Council, David Cornt, who's the leader of the Conservatives on the council, and Neil Eustace, who's on a Liberal Democrat from Birmingham City Council. David Cornt, first of all, this is a pretty lousy time to have a by-election coming up, isn't it?
Oh, yes, I think so. However, we're not perturbed. We'll go out there and we'll fight and we'll put our message over at the best of our ability.
And you clearly don't expect to win.
I'm not that pessimistic. I'm sure the people of Dudley will listen to the message we're putting over and consider it very carefully before they go out and vote.
What's your reaction? What's your reaction to the shambolic events of last night and to the government putting itself into the position of being a minority?
I think it's not before time that they did it.
Well, you'd like them to have had a minority earlier.
No, I would have liked them to have pulled people into line earlier and shown a bit of cabinet responsibility and parliamentary responsibility earlier.
Were you surprised that it wasn't your Prime Minister but the Chancellor of the Exchequer who did all the work last night?
No, I think it was a financial matter last night, and as a financial matter, the Chancellor of the Exchequer should do it.
And what impact has this all had on the voters in Dudley? Does it suggest that things are starting to unravel, as Tony King was saying here a moment ago, for the government?
I think the effects of last night are far too early to be able to be predictable on the doorstep. I certainly haven't been out on the doorstep today. I've been at work.
Fred Hunt for Labour, are you feeling the opposite of what David Cornt is feeling, which is yum yum, what a delicious time to have a by-election?
Well, of course, it's been a complete shambles. And of course, we've recently won the 2 council elections. And what has been happening over the past few years is the Tory government have stopped listening to people. And until they start listening, they don't even listen to their backbenchers. And this is why they're in extreme difficulty. I mean, people are absolutely fed up with this Tory government.
And is this despite an economy that we're going to hear from the Chancellor of the Exchequer today, no doubt, in glowing terms, is well on its way to recovering, and strongly too?
But nobody believes it. You see, the Prime Minister has told lies, the Tory party has told lies. The people have lost all trust in them. Whatever the economy is doing, they just don't believe that the Conservative government is the right government to govern this country. They've lost all credibility, and I think people are only waiting for a general election to kick them out.
Neil Eustace for the Liberal Democrats, it looks as though you've been rather squeezed in Dudley West. You've fallen in the last 3 elections, I think, in your vote, and you're really now watching a 2-party fight, a rather good test of who will win the next election.
Not at all, David. We've found that very many Conservative voters would not be voting Labour with any enthusiasm. They're actually looking to vote for us. And actually, traditional Labour supporters are concerned about their party's policy alterations, which seems to be making them a Conservative Party Mark II rather than a Labour Party. So I think we could see our party collect quite a few votes from both camps, David.
Okay. Well, just the last word from you, David Cornt. What are you looking for from this budget today? Do you think there's anything in that can stop Labour getting a 4% swing in their favour?
I think the important thing from the budget today is to maintain progress. One of your early interviewers said that things were on the up. I think the Chancellor's got to make sure that inflation remains low, competitiveness remains steady. We mustn't do anything that's going to risk the export-led recovery, and firms like this will be able to continue exporting to the rest of the world.
So, no sweets for the electors of Dudley West, simply the message that the thing is going all right.
I think that is probably all he can do. And as far as I'm concerned, if the long-term good of the country is at stake, then that's all he should do.
Even if Dudley West has to be sacrificed?
Even if Dudley West has to be sacrificed, the country must come first.
Thank you very much indeed. So the country first from Dudley West. We'll be going back to Dudley West, incidentally, to get some reaction to the state of the economy among people working in that factory and others later on. But let's go now down to Westminster, where there are a lot of MPs milling about today, but a lot of other people who go to see the budget statement or just see what's going on down there. Carol Walker, BBC's political correspondent, is there.
Good afternoon, and I'm joined here this afternoon by Pete Alder, who's interested in student issues, by Fiona Monkman, who's particularly concerned about benefits, and Reuben Reynolds. Now, Mr. Mr. Reynolds, you've come down with a group of pensioners from the Leicester, Nottinghamshire areas. What are your main concerns?
Well, my main concerns are many and varied, actually. I'm concerned about the fact that pensioners are getting a raw deal, students are getting a raw deal, the disabled are getting a raw deal, as indeed are the unemployed and the homeless.
And it's the VAT issue that's
And the
particularly
VAT
worrying you.
particularly, yes, because with regard to the VAT on fuel, we will be campaigning after this budget day today. We'll be getting petitions calling not for VAT not to be raised up to 17.5%, but for it indeed to be brought down to 5%, because you know maybe the government can bring it down legally within the European law. They can bring it down to 5%. That's what we want, and we'll be satisfied with nothing less than that.
Fiona Monkman, let me turn to you. Unemployment benefit, the job seekers allowance, those are the sort of things that you're worried about. Are you expecting to hear anything on this from the Chancellor this afternoon?
I think it's a commitment by the government to introduce the job seekers allowance, which the unions and unemployed people in Sheffield, where I come from, are completely opposed to. The attack on unemployed people, and it's shifting the blame for unemployment from themselves, the government, to unemployed people, which we are completely opposed to. It's completely wrong.
I think one thing we can predict is a message from the Chancellor that the economy is now back on course, inflation down and so on. What would your reaction be to that?
Well, I work in local government, and the people I work with feel absolutely no benefit from this so-called recovery. People are feeling far, far worse off. We've got VAT on fuel, we've got increased national insurance contributions, and we've got pay cuts. There's no way that anybody's feeling any better off with this government.
Pete Alder, you were a student until very recently. Very briefly, what would you like to hear from the Chancellor?
I'd like him to reverse the decision that was announced in last year's budget, where he cut the grants by 10% a year for the last year and the next 2 years as well. And I think we reverse that and reinstate benefits for students so that working class students can afford to go away to university or higher education without fear of finishing up thousands of pounds in debt, as currently is the case.
Thank you very much, all of you. Now back to the studio.
Carol, thank you very much indeed. Now we go back down to Westminster, where three senior politicians, one from each main party, joins us. Jack Cunningham for Labour, Charles Kennedy for the Liberal Democrats, and Angela Rumbold, Deputy Chairman of the Conservative Party. Angela, could I come to you first? I don't know whether you were hearing what Tony King was saying here, but he was comparing the position John Major's got himself into to the position Jim Callaghan got himself into when he found himself in a minority and actually had huge difficulty getting policy through, and in the end, indeed, of course, had to resign.
Well, I think the answer to that is that, of course, the people who have left the party whip in the last 24 hours have also said that they intend to support Conservative Party policy. So I imagine that on most of the major issues we should be seeing, although not whips, but many of those people coming to the Conservative lobbies when the policies are brought before the House.
Would you expect them to vote for 17.5% VAT on domestic fuel if that comes up before the House?
I think this is quite possible. I can't detect amongst those particular people a dislike of the rest of the party policies in the way that I think you're asking me to say.
But then if they're all going to vote with the Prime Minister, it's fairly meaningless to take the whip away from them. Why go to all that trouble?
That was quite a different matter. That was a matter on which the Prime Minister had asked for a vote of confidence. It was on a financial matter. It was on a matter where there was a commitment on his part to other nations, and he felt that it was very important. They did not share that view, and they did not vote.
But is there no danger of a party within a party, as one of those who lost the whip alleged there would be now?
No, I really don't think that's the case.
Not on Europe?
I think that's very unlikely indeed myself, and I think that time will tell precisely what is going to happen, but I suspect that a number of those people over the next few months will demonstrate extraordinary loyalty to the Prime Minister and to the Conservative Party policies in Parliament.
Jack Cunningham, do you believe that that is the position as Dame Angela spelled it out? Or do you think that John Major is at risk now of not living out his full term as Prime Minister?
Well, I don't think there's any similarity really between the present circumstances and what happened with the Labour government under James Callaghan. But the test will come on VAT, as you've suggested, David. There are a number of Tory MPs, not necessarily these 8 who've had their whip withdrawn, who said in their last election manifestos, their own local commitments, that they would oppose VAT on fuel. And so they'll get the opportunity when we campaign in the House and table amendments in the House against VAT being increased to 17.5%, to keep that commitment to their electors, and we'll see what they do. Of course, the Chancellor should really scrap the further imposition of VAT this afternoon. He could easily raise the revenue by having a much fairer approach to taxation. For example, windfall profits from the private monopoly utilities or from the huge share options which directors increasingly give themselves at consumers' expense, just to name but two.
When the dust settles on all this, may Labour not also have egg on its face for having voted against something that it so clearly supported, which is the increase in our payments to Europe?
No, we voted on our own reasoned amendment. We didn't vote against the second reading of the bill at all. And since the Tories are always whinging about Europe and saying they're going to be tough with Europe, why didn't they accept that there is a lot of waste and abuse in the European Union on the common agricultural policy, for example, on Euro fraud, which they talk about but do nothing about? For example, why did Mr. Major support an additional and unnecessary £300 million to build yet another new European parliamentary building in Strasbourg, which Labour has always opposed? So there's plenty of room there for us to take action against these abuses in the European Union and waste of money, while supporting the general principles embodied in the necessary legislation on enlargement.
And just on today's events, don't you have a real problem ahead of you, which is that the Chancellor is going to report an economy that's recovering fast and is going to recover faster over the next 2 years, and even if he doesn't do anything to sweeten voters' mood today, in a year or 2 years from now, he certainly will be able to?
Well, Mr. Maples doesn't believe that, does he? As he told us candidly last week, Angela's sitting here nodding her head to all that. Well, it'd be interesting to know whether she shares the Chancellor's view or her colleague in Central Office, John Maples' view. What Mr. Maples said, of course, is the truth. He just didn't want us to know that living standards are falling, that people see no sign of recovery, that they still feel their jobs are threatened, that impositions of VAT and incidentally 7 other additional tax increases which have still to feed through and further reduce people's standard of living, all those things are not going to make people feel that there's a recovery which is making them better off. They're going to be worse off.
Okay, well, Charles Kennedy, do you agree with that? Or do you think that this government does now have 2 years in hand to put right what John Maples pointed out was wrong with the way things are at the moment, with the Tory party that was saying things that nobody believed?
Yeah, I think there's no doubt, obviously, the economy will continue to recover. I think the problem for the government is not so much economic, or won't be so much economic over the next 18 months. It's one now of fundamental political credibility. Incidentally, on this issue of the whip being withdrawn, I think this is less of a problem than is popularly imagined, because if you look at the one Tory MP who did have the whip withdrawn from him and has now had it restored following a year's absence, as it were, Rupert Allison, I think the view across the road is that he was probably, for that year that he was in Borstal, or whatever you might call it, more loyal and more attentive to turning up to support the government, precisely because he was rather anxious to get back on board. So I think you might well find that apart from Europe, where there is a party within a party, this may not be the difficulty that's popularly imagined for the government.
So you're not going to be able to make any capital out of the government being in a minority? You're not going to be able to do any dirty business to unseat them?
Well, we'll certainly do our level best as an opposition party, but I'm not sure when you count in the Ulster Unionists, who for most other issues are on board as well, that the effective position in the division lobbies is going to be as good a prospect for the opposition parties as we saw last night. There will be specific issues. Europe is an obvious one. The VAT vote next week may be another one. But I think for a lot of their other domestic agenda, they're not going to be as tight in the lobbies as it might look at the moment.
Charles Kennedy, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Well, now let's turn and look at the main topic for this afternoon's events in the House of Commons, the state of the economy. And let's first of all see how things stand this Tuesday afternoon, a year on from the last budget we had, with Peter Snow. Peter.
It is really the central irony of this government, that here we have a deeply unpopular government, deeply unpopular Prime Minister, and yet so many of the indicators, the economic indicators, are looking more favourable than any time in recent memory. I mean, just go back, for example, to the time of the recession and look at the growth figures then and see what's happened now, and you'd think the recession would be a distant memory. Here's growth at minus 2.3%, negative growth in 1991 of minus 2.3%. Look what's happened in the 2 or 3 years since then. Minus 0.5 in 92, up 2.1, up 3.9% in 94, and in 1995, that steady, comfortable rate of growth, according to Goldman Sachs in the city, who are analyzing the economy for us, 3.7% forecast then. And the golden scenario for the government as well, you'd have thought. Inflation, up there, 5.9% at the time of the recession, tumbling down since then. Record levels of low inflation for the last couple of years, 2.4% now. Forecast by Goldman Sachs in the coming year to be going up, yes, up, but not too uncomfortably up to 3.7 by the end of next year, but enough perhaps for the Chancellor to worry a little about interest rates and to be worrying about the overheating of the economy, but they too have been dropping quite dramatically. Here we have February 1991, middle of the recession, 13.5% interest rates, whipping up there at the time. Britain left the ERM to 15, but coming right the way down here now to 5.75% at the moment, and forecast by the end of next year by Goldman Sachs, because of that sense of the economy overheating a little bit with inflation going up to 7.5%. Again, fairly encouraging interest rate figures for the Chancellor. Again, look at unemployment, 3.5 million at the depth of the recession, coming down, 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 2.5 million now. Next year, Goldman Sachs forecasting still coming down at long blue line down to 2.2 million. Now, why isn't the government more popular? Perhaps one of the indicators less favorable to the government that may give a hint as to why it is happening that people are not feeling that much better off because of the recovery is what's happening to their real disposable income. This is income in pocket, take-home pay, after taxation, after inflation. Now, in 1991, at the height of the recession, it was down 0.5%. People were actually worse off in real terms in their pockets in the recession by 0.5%. In the next year, election year incidentally, they were 2.7 better off in real terms. Then look how it's gone down since then with the rising taxation, Mr. Lamont and Mr. Clarke's rising taxation, low inflation, low increase in average earnings. So then this year, on last year, compared to last year, 0.4% worse off in real terms. But next year, hope for the government yet, Goldman Sachs are forecasting that next year, disposable income, even after all those taxes expected to go up in April next year, 2.3% rise in people's disposable income. So things are looking a little bit better for the government next year.
Thank you very much. John Monks, do you endorse that view that people are actually worse off, have less money to spend at the moment, despite 4% growth or so in the economy?
I'm sure that's right. The feel-good factor is not around for two reasons, I think. One is that people tend to feel very insecure. The kind of jobs that are being created tend to be either part-time or fixed-term or for the self-employed. Something like 70% of all the jobs that have been created are actually in that category at the moment. And I think that's having a big effect on the way people feel, as well as on the way people live. And the other fact certainly is the take out of pay that the tax increases have imposed. And we don't believe, and I think John Maples made this point in his famous memorandum as well, that actually people would still feel worse off next year because of these tax increases that are in the pipeline. So people aren't feeling good, and although there's some good news around on exports, for example, on public spending coming down and so other things are making people think that the outlook is pretty uncertain and pretty difficult.
Clive Thompson, from the point of view of a business, is that description of the economy one that you agree with, understand, or do businessmen also have their doubts about whether everything is quite as rosy as the figures suggest?
That's a situation that we've read about frequently, with an economy growing between 3 and 4%. But in practice, down in the marketplace, we are seeing the economic recovery very patchy. We see consumer demand coming through retail shops as being very small. We are seeing the housing and building material industry is fairly depressed. But we are seeing tremendous growth in exports. As far as businesses is concerned generally, we are concerned about ability to increase prices and recover margins, which were lost during the recession. We are concerned about raw material price increases, commodities in particular coming through. We're always apprehensive about labour costs, but there doesn't seem to be any undue pressure at this stage there. We're continually concerned about investment in our business for the future to increase capacity, improve productivity, and therefore we're keen to keep interest rates down. We're very keen to keep exchange rates where they are because we're currently competitive. So all these factors are factors which are of great concern to us today as far as the budget is concerned.
I mean, you'd like the Chancellor of the Exchequer to say everything's going all right and then sit down?
Well, that may be difficult to do, but in practice we probably would.
A do-nothing budget?
Well, we'd probably like to see a budget for business and maybe a budget for jobs also.
Peter J., how do you see things as having changed since you were here 12 months ago and we were talking about the last budget?
David, you said that this might be a steady as she goes budget. The last Chancellor who used that phrase in the budget speech was, we've heard his name a lot today, Jim Callaghan in 1967, and within 7 months the pound was devalued, as you will recall. One of the interesting things about the present recovery is that it was precisely a devaluation of the pound, the one on Black Wednesday in the autumn of 1992, which has provided the foundation for this extraordinarily rapid growth of exports, which have been the principal, indeed in recent months, really the only sustaining factor in the recovery that we've had. It also explains why it is that though output is rising remarkably rapidly, faster than 3% a year, disposable incomes, as Peter Snow's graphic showed, have actually been falling. And that's because a great deal of the income generated by the increased output in the field of exports is actually going into increased profits, profits which are being retained by companies and used to pay off debts. The big thing that's changed since a year ago is that the increase in output is faster than the Chancellor forecast, 3.5% instead of 2.5%, that inflation is less than he forecast. That has the implication that we didn't really need the tax increases which he announced a year ago, because there was more room for expansion without running into any kind of inflationary problem than people supposed. But apart from that, it's important to note that the better performance of the economy does not by itself create any room for tax cuts either this year or next, because while it does reduce the budget, the deficit, which you tell me I'm not allowed to speak about, it's rather like talking about Hamlet without mentioning the prince. While it does reduce the deficit, it also reduces the required deficit, because it means we're getting more rapidly back to a normal balance of the economy at the time when the budget needs to be balanced.
It was only for the sake of Peter's demonstration of the government borrowing that I didn't want you to speak about it then, but just before we see that, and we will talk about that and about the tax plans, it must be a galling position for a government to have got itself into, where it is getting big growth, 3.5%, 4% growth, and isn't able to pass any of the feeling of that on to the electorate. Indeed, has the electorate saying, we don't believe anything's changed.
But logically, it follows exactly from what the government itself was saying a year ago, both in Mr. Lamont's budget in the spring of '93 and in Mr. Clarke's in the autumn, namely that there was this thing which they called a structural deficit. In other words, even allowing for the recession, and you realize that recessions are going to cause a deficit because tax income falls down, you have to spend more money on unemployment and so on, but even allowing for that, there was too big a deficit. They therefore increased taxes, huge increase in taxes, £17 billion at an annual rate by the third year, the equivalent of 7p on the pound on income tax, in order to correct that imbalance, so that they argued, as the economy came back to normal equilibrium, as the recession ended, so the government's finances would come back into equilibrium. Well, if you come back into equilibrium rather more rapidly, because growth proceeds rather more rapidly, unemployment comes down a bit faster, then you reach that point where you require a zero government deficit sooner. It therefore does not create room for new tax cuts, none of which means that there won't be tax cuts. Of course there will be huge ones next year, but that's a political, not an economic.
Well, it may be logical, but it's politically jolly awkward, I should think.
Both those things are true.
Yes. Peter, let's just have a look then at that government borrowing and how it's going to affect the decisions the Chancellor is taking today.
Right, well, we'll bring Peter J's Prince back into Hamlet rather sharply now. The Chancellor can't possibly do anything about tax cuts until he's got the country's borrowing under control. Until he can demonstrate he's got the borrowing under control. Now, things are improving for him. The levels of borrowing are coming down. Go back, first of all, to Norman Lamont's last budget. Chancellor Lamont, March '93, he had to forecast piles of borrowing at huge heights, £50 billion last year's borrowing level, a record itself. The public sector borrowing requirement, the PSBR, the difference between what the Chancellor hands out in money to spend and takes in taxes, still keeping up here at huge heights right the way through to the possible end of a parliament in 1978, £30 billion borrowing requirement still up there. Now, by the time Chancellor Clarke produced his first budget last November, things were coming down a bit. Taxes had gone up, inflation was down, growth was up. All this was helping those borrowing levels to drop. 50 billion still up here, but look how that hill is steeply declining now to 12 billion by the end of a parliament there. Now, the latest figures from our city analyst Goldman Sachs suggest that things look even better. In the years ahead, the 46 billion outturn for last year is now traveling downhill here now to 16 billion by 96-7 and 11 billion by 97-8. Now, this is the one to look at. This is the likely year of an election. And this is the year, 96-7, for which the Chancellor, Kenneth Clarke, or wherever he is at that time, next November will be budgeting. And he may argue that that 16 billion is a sustainable level of borrowing to which he can add by giving us tax cuts, by giving us a windfall of, say, some £6 billion in that year and in the following year, raising the level of borrowing, yes, to 22 billion and 17 billion, but perhaps still a sustainable level. And £6 billion of tax cuts would mean 3p off the basic rate.
Peter, thank you very much. Peter J., what do you think the implication of that is for what the Chancellor is going to do? Are you suggesting that he is bound by those figures and can't do anything this year on tax cuts?
He could do something this year to the extent that what he did last year was a mistake. It was actually unnecessary, but he's certainly not going to say that. He's not going to say that when quite a substantial amount of the tax increases he announced last year are still to come into effect, will be coming into effect next spring, including the second half tranche of the value-added tax increase originally announced by Mr. Lamont.
Is it that, or is it a political desire to keep a bigger cherry available for a year from now or 2 years from now?
It is entirely the second. I mean, what we are saying, namely that he won't do it this year, but he will do it next year, is based on our assumptions, maybe unduly cynical, about his political reasoning about the run-up to the election. The fact is that he will be able to afford, as Peter Snow has explained, probably to give away 6, perhaps even 10 billion if he increases some other taxes a bit next year, which would be enough if he gets to 10 to give him a 20p basic rate of tax. But that isn't anything to do with the fact that the economy has been growing faster or inflation is less. It is entirely to do with the fact that he increased taxes last year by 6 billion and that he will probably find ways of increasing them in other ways a bit more next year, and that he's been able to cut government spending to some extent.
John Whiting, do you expect changes within the tax structures? I mean, that's to say the amount of tax different people pay, despite no overall reduction.
I think there's always going to be a certain amount of tinkering. I would imagine that such powder as he's going to shoot off this time will go in the direction of the lower paid, perhaps the increase in the basic lower rate band, the 20% band, that would help. Business would certainly like a certain amount of help on investment. We did a survey at Pricewaterhouse of clients, and that's one of the things that they would like, more incentives for training, more incentives perhaps to take additional staff on. But with the override, as being commented before, of keeping interest rates down.
Why can't they make their own decisions for the good of their business instead of looking to government to help them?
I think they would, but I think the thing is that if we can have a little bit of help from the government, that might help us on the marginal decisions. But really, the main thing they would like is keep inflation under control and keep the interest rates down. We've seen that they may have to go up a bit. Please, can we keep that increase as low as possible?
Tony King, let's just go back for a moment to the politics. Then we'll go up to Dudley and see what the people there feel about the state of the economy this afternoon. But on the political front, do you think the gamble of, if it's true, of holding tax cuts back until next year or the year after will pay off? Is that the way that voters will make up their mind, or are other factors coming in to the political equation now that will make it less easy to argue tax cuts equals electoral victory?
Well, there is one other factor coming into the political equation, and that factor is the Labour Party. One of the big differences between the politics now and the politics of the entire Thatcher period and the early Major period is that during the whole of that time, with the exception of a few weeks at the height of the poll tax rumpus in early 1990, the Conservatives were well ahead of the Labour Party on the central issue of economic management. Even when things were bad, people thought the Tories would run the economy better than the Labour Party. And at the moment, that position has been very sharply reversed. At the moment, Labour's lead on the central issue of economic management is the highest it has ever been by a very wide margin and for longer. And that's new, and that casts doubt as to whether this strategy is going to succeed in the long term.
Okay, let's go up to Dudley West now, to the glass factory there where we were earlier on with the politicians, and talk to some of the people who work in that factory. We've got 5 of them sitting around the table. Let me start with you, John Taylor. You're the production director up there. What do you think the feeling is, your own feeling, about whether this economy is getting up off the ground, whether people in Dudley are beginning to feel the benefit of the pace of growth of the economy?
Well, despite what people are saying, personally, there doesn't seem to be any improvement in the state of the economy. As far as people here are concerned, I think that, yes, something other than a neutral budget will help, but I think that people generally are looking for other factors. Personally, I think that employment is a key issue, the rising crime rate. I think these are key factors that the government keeps talking about but needs to address.
Right, and Pat Lewis sitting next to you, you're probably going to hear the Chancellor of the Exchequer trying to tell you that everything in the garden is rosy or is coming up roses. Do you feel everything's coming up roses from your point of view?
No, I don't think it is.
Can you tell me what it is that's wrong at the moment for you?
Well, the increases that are going on, myself, I'm more interested in the VAT that seems to be going on, heating, and obviously he's going to put it on other things too, eventually, and we're getting nothing to compensate for that.
Do you feel better off this year than you did, say, last year?
No, we're not.
Things are
Definitely
getting worse?
not. Yes.
What about the safety of your job and the business as a whole in the Dudley area? Do you feel people are nervous?
Yes.
Still?
Yes.
They are. Let me go on to Trevor Webster, who's sitting next to you. Mr. Webster, what about your view on this? You're work on decorating the glass up there, but you're also sort of active politically, or at least take a big interest in politics. How do you read the way things are going and how it's going to affect the by-election in Dudley West?
Well, I don't think that people keep going on about the feel-good factor, and I just don't feel good.
That's a very simple way of putting it. And what would you expect to get from the Chancellor then to make you feel good?
Nothing.
Nothing. So you don't think he can deliver?
I don't think he will do anything for me in this budget. I think he will in the next budget when there could be an election, general election.
So what do you make of all the talk of recovery and export-led growth and the rest of it?
I think there is an export-led growth, and I think it's very good. But the home market seems to be very static, and is that feel-good factor again?
Right, thank you very much. David Williams-Thomas is the managing director of the glass company. Now, are you feeling this? Are you getting export-led growth, but nothing much happening on the home market?
Welcome to Royal Brierley, David. Thank you very much for coming to see us today.
Thank you for the plug.
We've been here in Brierley Hill for 200 years, and obviously we intend to remain here another 200 years. Business has been extremely difficult, and it remains extremely difficult. But we are getting export-led growth. Our business in export markets has grown very substantially over the last 2 years. But the home market recovery is still extremely fragile. Whatever they say, whatever the economists say in London, the retail recovery is very patchy and very fragile.
And what do you attribute that to? Is it people not having money in their pockets, or is it people nervous about spending because they don't know what the future holds?
A bit of both. I mean, I think people's priorities are obviously home, mortgage. The basic bills have to come first. And after all, crystal tends to be somewhat of a luxury product, and maybe it comes a little bit further down the line. But
right. Well, Roger Hutt, I think, is also there, a businessman from another new company across the road. You've heard what the other four at the table said, Mr. Hutt. You've started a business in the last few years. How do you feel about the state of the economy? We're being told that it's growing fast. Do you sense that?
No, I don't. I speak to a lot of retailers, David, and they've had a terrible year. We have a saying around here, if I were going there, I wouldn't start from here. And I think that's the Chancellor's dilemma, that the economy is operating at such a low level. It's got to improve to a certain degree, but it's got a hell of a lot of improvement to do before it gets up to what it was a few years ago.
What is it that you think that the Chancellor could do today, then, to improve the feeling in Dudley West, if not before the by-election, at any rate over the next year?
Well, personally, I would like to see a commitment to stopping these horrific job losses like we've just had in the mining industry, because the real key to the success of the economy is more and more people having real jobs.
And you don't expect any particular measures today, then, that will cheer people up?
No, someone mentioned earlier tinkering, and I think that's what will happen. Probably a bit of tinkering with the tax thresholds. I wish he would forget the idea of the VAT on fuel, but I suspect that he won't. Just a bit of tinkering, I think.
Can I go back to John Taylor on the left-hand side of the table? Is there anything specific that you would like to see, even if you don't think the Chancellor would do it? Is there any trick you could offer to him if he wanted to win your heart this afternoon?
Well, I think speaking for the employees here, I think that if there was some way that we could get a small reduction in VAT and maybe promote spending, that's a general basis and a general point from me. I think on a personal note, again, for particularly the people in this part of the country, I think that if there were tax cuts or reductions which would help the difficulty that many people in this area are feeling.
Well, thank you very much in Dudley. I hope we may be able to go back up to Dudley after the budget if there's time. It rather depends how long everybody speaks this afternoon, not how long we speak, how long the politicians speak, and we'll get back to them and see their reaction to what happens. The Prime Minister left number 10 Downing Street a moment ago after a night which he sat beside his Chancellor while the Chancellor explained why people should vote for the measure, and 8 people lost the Tory whip. He now is, theoretically at any rate, has a minority of 2. Failure to have a majority goes through the Treasury building on his way to the House of Commons. Let's go back down to the House of Commons ourselves, down to Westminster, where we have our politicians, and we've been joined now by David Hunt, the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster. Mr. Hunt, first of all, perhaps you just answer the straight question about the condition the party is in now. The impression is getting about that something rather more has happened than seemed to have happened when 8 people had the whip withdrawn, that the ramifications of this can damage the party over the next year. Do you agree with that?
No, I don't. We won a confidence vote last night by a majority of 27. Looking to the future, I'm very sad that some of our colleagues felt unable to support us, but I very much hope that's a temporary matter and that they'll all soon rejoin the Conservative team.
But you think they'll rejoin? I'm sorry, I missed what you said. You're saying they'll rejoin the party. I mean, they'll have the whip given back to them.
Yes, of course, it's a matter for them now. They decided not to support us last night, and I was very sad about that because some of them are very close friends as well as good colleagues. It's a matter for them now. If they consistently and solidly support the Conservative government, then it's up to them if they wish to reapply for the whip. But whatever happens, I very much want to see them back within the party, within the Conservative team.
But hang on a moment. How are they going to get back the whip then? If they support you, you're saying, on a number of votes now, presumably including the 17.5% on fuel, are you saying they could have the whip back in a month or so? Do they go to the whip's office and say, please, can we have it back? We've been behaving properly?
Well, as you know, with Rupert Allison, he did come back and accepted the Conservative whip again. It is a matter for each individual to decide, and we'll judge them by the results of their actions. But above all, I believe, as we've been hearing on this programme, the economic background is extremely good. We have up to 2.5 years before the next general election. What we have to do is to get out there and communicate.
Yes, but just sticking on the point, I rather had the impression that you'd kicked them out of the party. You'd withdrawn the whip from them, so presumably it's up to you when you give the whip back to them and when you restore your majority.
Well, when you say we kicked them out, we made it clear last night it was a confidence vote. I believe if we hadn't made it a confidence vote, that bill would now be dead because the Labour amendment would have effectively killed the bill if it had been passed. Now we've overcome that. We've won that confidence vote by a majority of 27. They decided not to support us in the full knowledge of what that meant. But it is now up to each one of those individuals to make a decision as to whether or not they now continue to support, as I hope they will, the Conservative government, and then, of course, to reapply to take back the whip.
Yeah, but what is this decision? I mean, there's no issue coming up on Europe which they'll have to vote on, so they could perfectly well come in and say, from tomorrow we're with you again, until we come to the conference in '96.
Well, they will just have to decide whether or not they wish to take the Conservative whip. It's a matter for them, David. There's no great difficulty about this. It's happened in the past. I'm sure it'll happen again. All I'm saying is, personally, I'm very sad about what's happened, and I'd like to see us all back together again as quickly as possible.
Well, Jack Cunningham, what do you make of that? I rather thought it was like being drummed out of the regiment, but it seems it's just a club you can join if you want to, leave when you want to, and go back to when you choose.
I suppose it's laissez-faire, isn't it? It's market forces in the Tory party. Well, the reality is that the Conservative Party is deeply and irrevocably divided over Europe. I don't think those divisions are going to heal. Certainly not before the next general election. We know they go right to the heart of the government and the cabinet. They're not just involving backbenchers. And we have Mr. Maple's example that more and more the government is deciding what it's going to do in the interests of the Conservative Party and not in the interests of the country and economic recovery and social cohesion. So I think the row is going to go on in the Tory party. People know they are deeply divided.
and they're going to draw the consequence that really they're not in shape to go on governing the country.
Of course, it's nothing new to you, is it? Because you had a former Labour leader who lost the whip too, Michael Foot.
Yes, that was a very long time ago.
Yeah, a very deeply divided party too. We're just
No,
waiting.
I think he lost it on his own, didn't he? If my memory serves me right.
I think 5 others went with him.
Probably in sympathy, yeah.
Tony King's our historian here. We'll let him sort it out. Now it's a moment. The Chancellor of the Exchequer with his wife Gillian at number 11, coming down the steps of his official residence on his way to the House of Commons. He'll stand out with the Gladstone budget box on the pavement outside for the photographers there before he goes down to the House. His wife, incidentally, first in history at university and would have been an academic if she hadn't married into political life. He's been in Parliament, Mr. Clarke, since 1970 when he was elected to Rushcliffe at 30 years old. He was a whip to Ted Heath, but his cabinet career began with being Secretary of Health in 88, being Secretary of State for Education, then Home Secretary, and then when Norman Lamont resigned, Chancellor of the Exchequer, which he's been doing ever since, and a rather different style of Chancellor from Norman Lamont in every way, as his performance yesterday showed. Well, he succumbs to the blandishments of the photographers. People always make that mistake, but I suppose you have to do it. And give her a little kiss again. You probably heard the cry. So this is an interesting budget for Mr. Clarke because he's going to do it again. Oh, there we are. I like public demonstrations of affection. So he goes into his car and off on this difficult budget for him because while he's saying, as we've been hearing during this program, that everything in the garden is looking rosy, he's not actually in a position to cut the roses and deliver them to the electorate. Not this year, not perhaps even next year, maybe the year after that. So it's an awkward political operation of continually saying the feel-good factor is there, but then having colleagues like John Maples saying, you're saying it, but no one believes it, which of course is true from what we're hearing. Nobody does believe it, or nobody feels it, even if they believe the statistics. Down through the Treasury building there and on his way to the House of Commons. Right, well, let's go back to our politicians down at Westminster. Charles Kennedy, were you puzzled, as I was, by what David Hunt said about the way you get the whip back in the Tory party? And do you expect this to be a small problem over by the summer?
I was a bit puzzled, actually, because it seems to me that it's either much ado about nothing, or it's rather fundamental. Now, last night, it seemed to us it was rather fundamental. Prime Minister headed out of the chamber into the whip's office to talk to the chief whip about disciplining these recalcitrants that wouldn't support a motion of confidence, and the whip was withdrawn. Today, we seem to be getting slightly different mood music. I have to say, looking at the nice photographs there of Downing Street outside number 11, I'm glad to see the Chancellor is on much more affectionate terms with Mrs. Clarke than he is with large swathes of his own backbenchers, which the exchanges this time yesterday afternoon demonstrated.
You think he wouldn't kiss Theresa Gorman with the same enthusiasm, you mean?
Well, there is a film called Dracula, and I think that might be the appropriate nature of the kiss if one was to be exchanged.
So the leafless courtyard of Buckingham Palace, I don't know what I'm on about, the state opening of Parliament, of the Houses of Parliament, as the Chancellor's car turns in there. And it's now nearly coming up to 3:05. 10 minutes from now, we'll be down there for Prime Minister's questions. Just before we leave that, Charles Kennedy, what about this budget today? Do you think there's anything that can go into this budget statement that will help the Tories? Or do you think it is going to be a holding operation?
I think it's probably got to be a bit of a holding operation. There is obviously the outstanding issue of VAT, and there's maybe a 20% chance that he might surprise us on that, either by lowering the limit or by not implementing the next phase. I think there's an 80% chance he will, though, because he's been so publicly committed repeatedly on the record. I don't think there's a lot they can do now. I think what will well be the scandalous implications of this afternoon is that he will try and stoke up money with a view to significant tax cuts next year. But of course, the difficulty is that we should be investing in training and education and a better skills base for this country to take advantage of the growth and pulling out of recession which is currently underway. And if he forecloses that option by basically holding the cash back for boom and bust tax cuts in a year's time, the run up to the next general election, I think that will be disgraceful.
So you'd be holding our money to spend it rather than to give it back to us in a year's time?
Oh yes, I think that should be the priority.
Spend more of our money than they want to.
Well, I think you want to invest the money more
Yes.
wisely and not
Yes.
just give it away in consumerist tax cuts.
Right. Thank you very much indeed. Let's have a look at the possibilities the Chancellor has, Peter, can we, at the options that he's got this afternoon?
Right, David. We have to remember that there are £3 billion already in the pipeline in tax increases for the coming financial year. But on this budget itself, the actual budget speech, the Chancellor is likely to say that his budget judgment is that this should be broadly a neutral budget. In other words, leaving aside those £3 billion still to come in April, that this budget itself should not really give away overall more in tax or spend more than he originally intended. So nothing much will happen. But within that, of course, within that neutral overall strategy, he can shift taxes around quite a lot. So let's pay a call now on our British town and see what he may do to tinker around, as people have been putting it, with taxes on indirect taxes in the shops and direct taxes on income. We'll start with the shops and the off-license, that place of pilgrimage for many people no doubt in our town, and also for chancellors, I may say, in the past, and look at what might happen to cigarettes and drink. Well, now, cigarettes are going to go up by 8 pence a packet anyway, and he may put them up by twice that to penalise smokers. That'll bring him a nice fat amount of revenue from cigarettes. Beer has to go up 1 penny a pint to be indexed for inflation, but he may just say, I'd like a few headlines in tomorrow morning's papers, let's not put beer up by a penny a pint. That'll be indexing it for inflation. So would 3 pence a bottle on a bottle of wine. That would index it for inflation. He might not do that either. Spirits, he's almost certain to say no change because spirits face strong competition from the continent, and he may say that he want to be kind to manufacturers and not put them up. He's going to be a green chancellor, that's for sure. Let's move along to the garage down the road now. 3 pence is the price that petrol has to go up. He's already committed to that. 3% increase in real price of petrol. He might just pop it up by double that, perhaps 6 pence a litre. And also the vehicle excise duty, the disc in your windscreen, that could go up by £5 to £135. So he's sure to make motoring more expensive. No question about that. Past the pub on the corner now and down to the electricity showroom and the gas showroom. And as we know, he has already indicated that domestic fuel is going to go up to the full 17.5% of VAT on domestic fuel will go up. A lot of pressure on him not to do that, but as Robert Oakley was saying earlier, he's likely to stick to his guns. Now, all budgets have a surprise somewhere, so watch for a surprise from Kenneth Clarke. Maybe it just could be that he makes newspapers subject to VAT. He wants to extend the field of VAT. Maybe he'll make newspapers subject to VAT. His backbenchers would like that, and would get their own back on the tabloids. Now let's look at income tax, and first of all, those who own houses, of course, will know that mortgage relief is to go down to 15% from April 1995. That's one of those hidden taxes, one of those taxes in the pipeline, tax increase in the pipeline. He may just announce, watch for him to announce that by April 96 they could go down to 10%. Those mortgage reliefs could go down to 10%, all part of the travelling to the stage when you get to the abolition of mortgage relief altogether. Now, on the other side of the street, let's look at income tax itself. And here again, one of those pipeline tax increases already provided for. Married couples allowance is going down to 15% from April. That's going to cost people more who are married. Allowances, will he put them up by 2%, index them up for inflation, or will he leave them flat and actually in real terms cost people another 33 pence or so a week? So watch to see what he does with allowances. He may, a little nugget there, for example, he may widen the 20% lower rate band by £1,000, say from £3,000 to £4,000. Who knows? What is almost certain, as we've all been saying, is that the really critical change, the basic rate of tax, the 25 pence and the pound rate of tax, unlikely to see any change there. We probably have to wait till next year until he's demonstrated he can get borrowing under control for him to start reducing the basic rate of tax. So there it is, swings and roundabouts, not a great deal of change in this budget, but we'll be revisiting our town later to see who's better off and who's worse off as a result of it all.
Peter, thanks very much. Now, John Monks, what would you like to see of those options, the Chancellor taking and the Chancellor rejecting?
Well, I hope he doesn't actually hold steady and actually is rather bolder than many people seem to be suggesting he should be. There's been one or two mentions of a budget for jobs, but I think he really should do two things. Firstly, he should really tackle training. this recovery phase that we're in at the moment could soon hit the buffers of skill shortages and all the problems that that's caused in the past.
Is there time to train people for this?
Well, there is.
For this year or
There's
2
a time
years?
to start, and if you don't start quickly, then in fact you'll run into some real big problems down the line.
So,
I
like
think he should
spending on training,
yeah,
you'd like to see.
and also start trying to get employers much more generally to train much more adequately than they do at the moment. I think too it's important that we have a look at the way the benefits work. There's a lot of poverty around in Britain at the moment, and simply, in a sense, steady as she goes and being complacent about all that poverty is wrong. And we're arguing this year for an increase, particularly in child benefit, to help people who are particularly feeling the worst effects of the present insecure and feel bad factor, which is so common around the country.
He himself has talked about that, hasn't he? About poverty.
He has,
in a lecture just recently. So it may be that he's planning to do something on that area, and that rather grey area of whether it's you're better off in or out of work because you're on benefit that disappears very rapidly when you do go back into work. So we could get something on that.
Well, I think I'm particularly looking to see this afternoon whether he does find some way of adjusting the benefits system to help people into work.
Yes.
But I hope it's not just into these low-paid, low-grade jobs, which seem to be what's on offer in Britain today on far too wide a scale.
Clive Thompson, you've heard Peter's analysis there of what room there is for manoeuvre, or what possibilities there are for the Chancellor to take action. What would you like to see him do? I mean, if you accept the parameters that he's not going to have a splurge.
Well, clearly, we, as a businessman, what we would like to say is we'd like to see no tax increases on business, but you'd expect him to say that. But overall, we in the CBI would very much favour no net tax reduction. That's not to say that we wouldn't very much support education and training initiatives. What we would like to see within no net tax reduction is something to encourage investment, capital investment in business.
Why do you need to encourage it? I mean, is it either, I mean, as I was saying a moment ago, isn't it either something businesses ought to be doing or something that they don't need subsidising to be encouraged to do?
Well, there seems to be a fundamental difference between small businessmen's attitude and large companies, in that large companies in many cases are prepared to invest new capital where they see the volume opportunities as being there. But small businessmen in many cases will only invest in their businesses when they see the opportunity to do so, are encouraged to do so by taxation. And this is why we in the CBI have repeatedly called for capital allowances and improvement of capital.
But you don't represent the small businesses.
You represent the CBI represents small
You represent the
businesses.
big businesses.
We represent
the big battalions.
Hundreds of thousands of businesses throughout this country.
Right, and so you want to see a subsidy to the small businessman to get him to do what he otherwise wouldn't do?
No, I don't think we'd call it a subsidy. We'd like to see the allocation of taxation.
All right. Anything else?
I think special measures for small businesses, a whole raft of them we'd like to see.
Yes. What about the things that John Monks was talking about the people who are suffering poverty, about people who can't get into work because it's not worth their while because of the way that Social Security is arranged? Do you want to see measures there?
Clearly, we have a lot of sympathy with people who are unemployed, and would, in my opening statement, I said I believe it should be a budget for jobs and for employment. But the difficulty with all sorts of measures to improve employment is to create real jobs, jobs which are there, and not to subsidise some workers against another worker.
Right. Tony King, we're going down to the House in a couple of minutes. What do you think the Chancellor, given those constraints, what's he got that he can do to help himself win an election a year from now or 2 years from now? And he could even be leader of the party, I suppose.
Well, we've got the feel-good factor amongst the general public, which we keep talking about, but there is the question of the feel-good factor amongst Conservative MPs. And thinking just of this afternoon's budget, I would have thought one of the things that the Chancellor very much wants to do is to reinforce his own personal position, reinforce the government's position by producing something in this budget that Tory MPs will be able to cheer. We're told it's going to be a very dull budget, so one doesn't talk about the icing on the cake, but maybe there's going to be some icing on the porridge. In fact, I'll be very surprised if it's not there. We don't get something that Tory MPs can be happy about.
Peculiarly disgusting gastronomic treat, you suggest. But Peter Jay, what do you think the Chancellor, if anything, can do for his own political good with the electorate?
Well, I suppose what he would need to do would be to convince the electorate of the traditional Tory message that the economy is safe in the hands of the Tories, and that come the next election, it will be safer to leave it in the Tories' hands than to let it be transferred to the hands of the other parties. As Tony King's already pointed out, this is not simply a matter of how good or bad the Conservative Party appears, it's also a matter of how good or bad the Labour Party appears, and it appears from polling evidence that the electorate thinks that the Labour Party is rather more attractive or less forbidding than it seemed to be for a very long time in between. But I think we ought possibly, the one thing we haven't mentioned, which is a very important part of the whole strategy, which is interest rates. All this year, there has been talk in the city about the need to raise interest rates in order to ward off possible increasing inflationary pressures. There's been absolutely no sign of these pressures. Indeed, inflation has subsided. The underlying rate is now down to 2%, the lowest it's been for 27 years. The pressures for increasing interest rates, sometimes when the Governor of the Bank of England meets the Chancellor, go on. It will be very important, I think, the Chancellor to keep interest rates at a very low level.
Thank you very much, Peter. Well, let's go down now to the House of Commons. The Prime Minister is sitting there looking fairly cheerful in his blue tie, and Michael Portillo's answering the last question, I suspect. And we join Tim Fenton.
As you say, the Prime Minister in his place, answering the usual question about his day.
This morning I presided at a meeting of the Cabinet and had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall be having further meetings later today.
Madam, can the Prime Minister tell us whether his government will treat any vote on reducing VAT on domestic fuel as an issue of confidence? Yes or no?
As the Honourable Lady knows, that on fuel has been approved by this House on several occasions. I think from memory, 4 occasions. It was introduced 2 budgets ago. It would clearly be a very important vote if a fresh vote was manufactured on this issue, but it does not fall in the same category as the European Community vote.
Cheryl Gillan. Number 2, Madam Speaker.
Question 2. I refer my honourable friend to the reply I gave some moments ago.
Cheryl Gillan. Did my right honourable friend have the opportunity to listen to the interview yesterday with the chairman of Rentokil, one of our most
A lot of Labour laughter at that one. Opposition benches, members pointing across the House at the Conservatives.
Order! 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 The House must come to order! This is using very valuable time. Miss Gillan, come along. Thank you, Madam Speaker. The opposition finds one of our most successful businesses in the UK amusing. And this company was awarded the most respected award in a Management Today survey last week. The chairman of Rentokil said that in his experience, the low inflation, the low costs, and the record exports in this country were unprecedented. Isn't that the real story, Madam Speaker, and the background to today's budget statement?
Well, there's no doubt, Madam Speaker, that both businessmen and businesswomen around the country recognise we have the best combination of economic circumstances for many years. My honourable friend is quite right to state that that is the background to the budget, and I've no doubt my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, will sketch out further details shortly.
Tony Blair.
Madam Speaker, is it true, as some of his backbenchers have been saying earlier this morning, that in exchange for their support last night, they were offered a referendum on further European integration by ministers?
I made my views clear to the House in May, and my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, echoed those views only last Friday. They haven't changed.
Emma Nicholson.
In his busy day, has the Prime Minister noted the visit? In his busy day, has the Prime Minister noted the visit of the Speaker of the National Assembly of Kuwait and of his colleagues? Would the Prime Minister not like to endorse now the integrity of Kuwait's sovereign border and the need to keep Kuwait alone, intact, and in power as a state?
I'm happy to do as my honourable friend asks, and I think that would be the overwhelming view of every member of the House. Recently, when yet again it seemed as though the integrity of Kuwait's border would be threatened, British troops, planes and aircraft were there to defend it. That would, of course, be the position were that to happen again.
Stephen Byers.
Number 3, Madam Speaker.
I refer the honourable gentleman to the reply I gave some moments ago.
Byers.
Will the Prime Minister confirm that last year his government spent £355 million on management consultants? Is he aware that such a sum of money would have paid every pensioner's bill for VAT on fuel?
Doesn't the Prime Minister feel the time has come for his government to get its priorities right and to put the needs of pensioners before the profits of city consultants?
Well, I think, as the honourable gentleman knows, very substantial sums of money have been made available to assist pensioners with their value-added tax on fuel bills. Very large sums have been made available, and there's no relationship between that expenditure and expenditure on management consultants to help improve the efficiency of government, release resources, keep taxes down, and help ensure there is money available, to help pensioners and others.
Sir Roger Moat.
Would my right honourable friend share the widespread disappointment that Norway will now not be alongside us in our battles against a federal Europe and against a single currency? But bearing in mind the immensely strong ties that exist between our two nations, will he and the government do their utmost to ensure the continuation of the European Economic Area, which is such a beneficial arrangement for Norway and for the whole of Europe?
Well, I'm extremely sorry that the Norwegian people decided not to join, but of course we respect their decision in that. They would have been a net contributor to the European community, and I think in many issues, but perhaps not all, they would have been valuable allies for the British point of view in Europe. I am, however, delighted that Austria and the other EFTA states have decided to join.
Margaret Hodge.
Number 4, Madam Speaker.
I refer the honourable lady to the reply I gave some moments ago.
Margaret Hodge.
Now that he leads a minority government, will the Prime Minister break the habit of a lifetime and stick to at least one of his election pledges and scrap the proposed rise of VAT on fuel?
Well, I think the honourable lady heard me say just a few moments ago that the House had debated that matter on 4 separate occasions.
To Clapperson.
Is my right honourable friend aware that in my constituency alone, hundreds of children from less well-off families benefit from the assisted places scheme? Isn't it a shame that the party opposite want to deprive children of that opportunity, especially when its leadership has had the benefit of a similar opportunity itself?
Well, I entirely agree with my honourable friend about the assisted places scheme. The whole purpose of that scheme, and indeed of the educational reforms generally, is to give children opportunities that otherwise they wouldn't have had. And I regret very much that many of those opportunities seem to attract the opposition of the party opposite. One of the more distasteful sides of politics is seeing those who climbed up the ladder of opportunity kicking it away from other people.
Mr. David Rendell.
Number 5, Madam Speaker.
I refer the honourable gentleman to the reply I gave some moments ago.
Rendell.
What moral difference does the Prime Minister see between what we all agree is wrong, namely members of this House accepting payment to ask questions, and a party which accepts payment from the tobacco industry in return for vetoing a ban on tobacco advertising?
Hear, hear. There is no relationship between the two facts.
Sir James Spicer.
My right honourable friend will remember the speech he gave last Thursday at the Staff College at Camberley, and he will also know how well received that speech was by the students there. In that speech, he referred specifically to Bosnia, and he said that we could not impose peace on those who did not wish to accept it, and if we tried to do so, we would need many hundreds of thousands of troops on the ground. Will the Prime Minister give us all an assurance that those troops, British troops, French troops, Dutch troops, and all the others who've served in Bosnia will be our first priority, and that if need be, he will make sure that they come out of that mess safely?
Let me say to my honourable friend that I reject totally some of the lurid and misplaced criticism of the United Nations Protection Forces, which have been made in some American newspapers over the last few days. The protection forces in Bosnia are not a combat force. They were never intended to be a combat force. They are not equipped there to be a combat force. They are there on an humanitarian mission, and that mission has saved the life of hundreds of thousands of Bosnians. I very much wish to see UNPROFOR continue its humanitarian work, so long as it can do its job without unacceptable risks to the United Nations troops that are there. But I have to say to the House, if the parties to the conflict make the humanitarian task of UNPROFOR impossible, if they intensify the war rather than seek a peaceful settlement, then they could create the conditions in which the United Nations would have no choice but to withdraw. I do not wish to see that, but I have to state to the House that that could happen.
Simon Hughes.
Number 6, Madam Speaker.
I refer the honourable gentleman to the reply I gave some moments ago.
Mr. Hughes.
When the Prime Minister was elected first 4 years ago, he set himself the aim of creating a nation at ease with itself. In the light of last night, at which of the following does he think he's been more successful? Creating a nation at ease with itself, or a party at ease with itself?
Well, I am grateful to honourable gentlemen on the Labour benches for suggestions as to how I should reply to the Liberal benches. Given the fact that you can find a different Liberal policy from each Liberal to the next, and a different Liberal policy from each door to the next, each street to the next, and each constituency to the next, I think the honourable gentleman should look at his own party before he criticises mine.
Ashby.
Is my right honourable friend aware that in a recent survey of every household in my constituency, over 90% expressed themselves satisfied with the National Health Service? This is reflected in other surveys. Will my right honourable friend join me in condemning those newspapers which continually talk down one of the finest health services in the world?
Well, I will happily join my honourable friend in that. There's no doubt about the affection for the National Health Service. And although we often hear a great deal of generalised criticism of it, that criticism tends not to come from the people who've just had treatment themselves within the National Health Service. They tend to be very supportive of it, and rightly so, because of the treatment it offers and the service it gives.
The Youngman Jones.
Madam Speaker.
I refer the honourable gentleman to the reply I gave some moments ago.
When Jones.
Madam Speaker, I'm sure the Prime Minister will wish to join me in congratulating customs officers, including those based at Holyhead in my own constituency, in their efforts to combat drug smuggling. Would you agree with me that those efforts would be severely damaged if these reports that 4,000 customs officers are to lose their jobs as a result of an announcement today? How will that equate with the battle the Prime Minister has announced, the war on drugs? Won't it blow a gaping hole in his policy?
Well, the honourable gentleman is quite right about the importance of the battle against drugs, hence both the domestic and the international initiatives we've taken, hence the work set in train by the committee chaired by my right honourable friend, the Lord President. Whatever may happen to the budgets the honourable gentleman refers to, I can assure him the battle against drugs will not suffer.
Peter Emery.
Madam Speaker, will my right honourable friend, in welcoming Senator Dole into this country, point out that the United States Congress has many friends on both sides of the House, but that friendship has been built up by members of Congress and the Senate fully understanding what's the work of their allies?
Well, I certainly look forward to meeting Senator Dole tomorrow, and I know he's also meeting my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, and my right honourable friend, the Defence Secretary. We have a wide range of matters to discuss, and I'm sure there'll be fruitful and productive discussions.
Janet Anderson.
Number 8, Madam Speaker.
I refer the honourable lady to the reply I gave some moments ago.
Janet Anderson.
Can the Prime Minister confirm the reports that the President of the Board of Trade is looking again at the privatisation of the Post Office?
I don't think the honourable lady should be in any doubt that we think the right decision when we have a majority in this House is to privatise the Post Office.
Peter Turner.
Will my right honourable friend consider giving greater powers to the shareholders of privatised utilities to consider the salaries, to decide the salaries of their directors in advance, rather than reading about them months after the event?
Well, I think my honourable friend makes an ingenious suggestion that I am happy to consider.
Mr. William McKelvey.
Number 9, Madam Speaker.
I refer the honourable gentleman to the reply I gave some moments ago.
McKelvey.
The Minister appears to be somewhat ambivalent over the question of referendum in European Union affairs. Could we please have a referendum in Scotland so that we could tell the Prime Minister in this country how we wish to be governed?
I seem to recall the honourable gentleman had a referendum on that issue some years ago, and he knows, and in their hearts most people know, that the establishment of a Scottish Parliament would be immensely damaging for Scotland and immensely damaging for every part of the United Kingdom as well. It may well be the policy of the party opposite, and we shall test to what extent it is over the weeks ahead, but it is not a thought-out policy. It is not a policy in the interests of Scotland. It's not a policy in the interests of the people of Scotland, and it's not a policy in the interests of the United Kingdom as a whole.
Time's up. By leave of the House, I put together the 6 questions on the motions relating to statutory instruments. The question is that the 6 instruments be referred to a standing committee on statutory instruments. If any other opinion, say aye. Contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Chairman of Ways and Means.
Now, the traditional change of person in the hot seat, the Speaker, Betty Boothroyd, stepping down, the Chairman of Ways and Means, Michael Morris, taking over.
Before I call the Chancellor of the Exchequer, it may be for the convenience of honourable members if I remind them that at the end of the Chancellor's speech, copies of the budget resolutions will be available to honourable members in the vote office. Mr. Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, the financial statements and the budget report, with a number of press releases filling out the details of my proposals, will be available from the vote office as soon as I have sat down as well. I was making sure I had the honourable gentleman's attention. I congratulate him on his alertness. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I have 3 priorities in my budget this year. First priority, to keep the economy on track, to achieve the great prize of sustainable growth. This recovery offers the best prospect that the British people have faced for many years to enjoy the benefits of growth that doesn't pass through illusory boom to painful bust. My second priority has been to use this recovery wisely to encourage the creation of more jobs, particularly for people who've been out of work for some time. We must combine greater prosperity for the majority of our people with measures to prevent the emergence of a deprived underclass, excluded from the opportunity to work and dependent on welfare. And the third priority is to strengthen our economy in the longer term. We must aim for a modern economy in which the growth of enterprising companies will give people a greater sense of confidence in the flow of new jobs that will always be required to replace the old jobs eroded by technology and competition. And Mr. Deputy Speaker, the background to this year's budget is the healthy growth in output that we're seeing in Britain and overseas. The recovery has been underway at a modest pace for over 2.5 years, but it's now stronger, and output has grown by over 4% over the past year, and that's easily the fastest rate of growth of any of the major European economies. And the forecasts I'm publishing today with this budget show the economy expected to grow by 3.25% next year. As the recovery's got stronger, growth's increasingly come from exports. Over the last year, British exports have grown by over 8%. Investment in plant and machinery has grown by over 5%, and consumer demand has increased by a more modest 2 to 3%. And that's a very healthy shape for this stage of the recovery, and it bodes well for our long-term future as a competitive industrial economy. Our exporters have been able to take advantage of the pickup in growth overseas by keeping their costs down and raising their productivity. Our producers have succeeded in improving their performance in domestic markets, so that while exports continue to rise, imports are little changed. Overall, I expect our balance of payments on current account to improve by over £6 billion this year. And an improving balance of payments is remarkable for this country at a time when the economy is growing strongly. And more encouragingly still, inflation has remained low. Underlying inflation has fallen to levels that we haven't seen for a generation. Indeed, only about 1/3 of the adult population of this country have ever experienced such low inflation during their adult life. And the other 2/3 are still finding it difficult to adjust to the change to a low inflation economy. Unemployment. And they're not going to adjust back under the Labour Party either. Unemployment's on a clear downward trend, having fallen by over 450,000 since December 1992. The United Kingdom, as I've already said, is the only major economy in Europe where unemployment has fallen over the past year. The unemployment rate in this country is lower than the average for the European Union, and the number of people in work is rising. The labour force survey shows an increase of 226,000 in the number of people in work in the last 12 months. And that means real new jobs for people up and down the country. So, Mr. Deputy Speaker, we're seeing strong output growth, strong export growth, falling unemployment, an improving balance of payments, and low inflation. And this combination is almost unique in this country since the war. But let us be under no illusions. These promising conditions have to be sustained if they're to deliver higher living standards and secure jobs for men and women. And these promising conditions have only arisen at all because of the difficult decisions that this government has been prepared to take in recent years. We must not now throw away the gains that have been made by turning to some short-term dash for yet faster growth. Growth will only be sustained if we keep the lid on inflation, get public borrowing down further, and push ahead with measures which strengthen the industrial economy. That is the way to convert growth into prosperity and jobs. And that way lies the virtuous circle of improved competitiveness, rising productivity, economic growth, low inflation, and more jobs. And we mustn't change our minds now for the sake of short-term popularity. And those that bask in their short-term popularity and neglect the need for sound economic measures will live to rue the day hereafter. But only by keeping our nerve and sticking to the determined policies that we put in place over the last couple of years will we be able to enjoy the full fruits of improved economic performance in the rising prosperity and lower unemployment. Now, Mr. Deputy Speaker, let me deal first with inflation. Low inflation creates a climate of stability which encourages savings and investment in the future of this country. And nothing will be more damaging than if we let inflation off the leash again, only to have another dose of bitter anti-inflationary medicine. The British experience is that high inflation has brought economic recovery to a halt 3 times over the past 20 years. That's 3 times too often for my liking. And while we've succeeded in bringing inflation down to levels that were last seen when England won the World Cup, we must never take that for granted. Well, before that game, I had lived in a low inflation economy. After that game came Harold Wilson, as far as politics were concerned. But I live in a low inflation economy again now. And I'm glad to say that our inflation rate is now well below the European average. We need to keep up this performance if we're to be a competitive manufacturing nation enjoying the living standards of the best in future. I will therefore, Mr. Deputy Speaker, continue to set interest rates to meet our objective of keeping underlying inflation in a range of 1 to 4%, and in the lower half of that range by the end of the present Parliament. It's a tough target by Britain's recent standards, but not by those of some of our best competitors. To make sure we achieve it, I've backed good intentions and resolve with a number of important decisions over the last year that have strengthened the framework of policy. The Bank of England's quarterly inflation report is now fully independent of the Treasury. The Governor decides the precise timing of interest rate changes. And most importantly, I decided in the spring to publish the minutes of my meetings with the Governor. As a result, we in Britain now have one of the most open frameworks for monetary policy making in the world. And this will stand us in good stead in keeping inflation permanently low. But it will most certainly not avoid the need to take tough decisions at times. In September, the Governor and I agreed that with the recovery strengthening at home and prices rising abroad, there was a sufficient risk of inflation picking up here to justify raising interest rates then by 0.5%. By acting before retail price inflation itself picks up, we will aim to nip inflation in the bud. I expect inflation to rise slightly over the next year, reaching a temporary plateau of around 2.5%. That's a result of higher commodity prices and stronger profit margins in our very buoyant manufacturing industries. But continuing competitive pressures will ensure that producers and retailers keep costs under control and pass on the benefit to consumers. And I expect that underlying inflation should then resume its downward trend. Now, before I turn on from inflation to public finances, I can announce an important further development of the gilts market. The Bank of England is publishing today a consultative document on the establishment of an open sale and repurchase, the so-called repo market. This should improve both liquidity and efficiency, reducing yields and hence reducing the government's debt interest costs. And each reduction in yields, just 1 basis point, which is 1/100th of 1%, will eventually save more than £25 million a year of public expenditure. But I turn now to the public finances. Last year, I continued the process started by my right honourable friend, the member for Kingston-on-Thames. I announced measures which cut the public sector borrowing requirement by 1.25% of GDP by the end of this Parliament. Combined with the healthy growth in the economy that we're now enjoying, those measures have helped bring the public sector borrowing requirement from £45.5 billion in 1993 to 1994 to an expected £34.5 billion this year. My objective remains the same, to balance the budget over the medium term. Now, we remain on course to eliminate government borrowing entirely by the end of the decade. By 1996 to 97, borrowing will be approximately equal to the government's net capital expenditure. About half of my own cuts in public borrowing last year were achieved through cutting public spending plans. But because of the length of the recession, my right honourable friend and I also had to raise taxes to meet the objective of healthy public finances. Delay and failure to act would have caused since then intolerable additional pressures to raise interest rates faster and to raise taxation still further. We wouldn't have had strong and sustainable recovery now if we had failed to cut spending and raise taxes last year. And for that reason, the public spending cuts and the tax increases that I announced last year remain, of course, quite essential to the strategy of achieving economic recovery. We restored confidence in our ability to achieve sustained recovery by the process of taking firm measures. And we would damage that confidence again if we now seem to falter or even to go back on any of the measures that we've already put in hand. Now, I am able to improve the package of help that I announced last year to cushion the effects of VAT on fuel on all pensioners and on vulnerable groups, enormous though that package was when I announced it last year. Last year, I doubled public spending on the very effective home energy efficiency scheme. So for the first time, everyone over the age of 60 became eligible for a grant. This has been a huge success. Soon, over 1 million people will have received grants to improve the insulation of their homes, reducing their excessive heating bills and improving their comfort. That's still not enough. Therefore, on top of last year's doubling, which will of course be carried forward each year, now going to add another £10 million a year to the resources to fund grants. Soon, Mr. Deputy Speaker, British homes will at last be a match to the British weather in every part of the United Kingdom, especially for the elderly. Cold weather payments were set at £6 each week only 2 years ago. I now intend to increase them to £8.50 each week in order to reassure people they will get help with their bills when spells of freezing weather occur. Now, furthermore, next year, 1995 to 96, there'll be an additional £52 for single pensioners and £73 for couples built into all retirement pensions as compensation for VAT on fuel. From April 1996, there will be £68 extra on the single pensioner rate and £96 extra for pensioner couples. Now that's more than the whole of the VAT on fuel bills for a significant number of them. In addition, electricity prices have been falling for many people. Gas prices are to be raised for the first time since 1991, but this will be coupled with discounts for prompt payment that will reduce many people's bills. So far, the House should appreciate that including the first stage of VAT, the 8% already in payment, both gas and electricity bills have fallen by 1% in real terms over the last 2 years. And that real terms fall is for everybody, before taking into account the package of help for pensioners that's so far in payment. And the full burden of the tax is, of course, only borne by people of working age who are not receiving means-tested benefits. And I made it quite clear that people of working age can't expect tax cuts or a reverse of previously announced tax increases this year. So I'd now like to turn this year's budget to the government's new plans for public spending. Last year's budget set a new milestone in the control of public spending. We managed to reduce the control totals that had been set in the previous spending round by £8 billion over 3 years. And we reduced general government expenditure by £15 billion over the same period. And that was a measure of the success of the new system of public expenditure control that we first introduced in 1992. Last year was the first fruits of the programme of fundamental reviews of all departments. The reaction to this new approach was very predictable. A welcome from this side of the House, criticism and alarmist nonsense from the party opposite, and scepticism from the so-called experts who doubted whether those plans could be delivered in practice. Well, in fact, for the current year, first year, following on from last year's announcement, 1994 to 1995, we expect to do better than the plans that were set, and we expect to underspend by more than £1 billion. Now, at the start of this year's survey, Cabinet decided that we should also keep within last year's planned totals for 1995 to 96 and for 1996 to 97, and we should allow no more than 1% real growth for 1997 to 1998. Plans I'm about to announce deliver that remit, but it hasn't been easy. Last year's settlement was extremely tight, and I'm grateful to my right honourable friend, the Chief Secretary, for his skillful handling of what has been an extremely difficult spending round. Now, we've been guided by 4 basic principles this year. Firstly, we've taken advantage of the welcome fall in inflation since the last budget. Thanks to lower inflation, the price levels we'll be facing in 1995 to 1996 will be 2.5% lower than we expected they would be when we decided on spending plans last year. We have not let that feed through into a higher level of real resources for government departments. We've reduced our cash plans for almost all programs. Lower inflation needs to be matched in the public sector by lower cash spending. Second principle is that we built on the increasingly important role played by private finance. All government departments are now looking actively at private finance options for their capital expenditure. Third, we focused our search for savings on administrative and running costs, cutting the back office and protecting the frontline delivery of our key public services. Our aim has been to provide a better output of public services for fewer inputs. Fourthly, we've taken a close look at the government's own spending priorities. We've looked for savings on some programs so that resources can be channeled into the services and policies to which the government attaches most importance. The honourable gentleman mentioned, reacted to my mention of private finance. Mr. Deputy Speaker, privatisation and private finance for capital investment are rapidly becoming the chosen method for raising the quality of public services in the majority of countries in every continent in the world. They started in this country, although the political debate here has been transformed since I first became a minister. An irritating amount of post-socialist resistance still persists here. But fortunately, the Honourable Gentleman for Kingston and Hull will welcome the news that the government's private finance initiative remains alive and well and is growing rapidly. Now, last year I announced the number of transport schemes would go ahead under the private finance initiative, and significant progress has been made. £370 million of private capital has been invested in transport projects over the last 2 years, with a further £760 million already committed. In addition, £3.5 billion worth of projects are currently out to competition, and the value of contracts placed will steadily build up from a stream to a significant flow. But the private, Honourable Gentleman doesn't look so cheerful. The private finance actually runs wider than transport. There are now over 50 health projects, either approved or completed, bringing over £100 million worth of new capital into the National Health Service. Bids have been received for the first 2 privately financed prisons, and over £1 billion worth of information technology projects are now following or considering the private finance route. In higher education, universities now get approaching 1/3 of their revenue from the private sector, and my right honourable friend, the Environment Secretary, announced on the 31st of October new proposals to make it easier for local authorities to form joint ventures with the private sector. New projects are constantly emerging as the initiative breaks new ground. Today I can announce that we're on course to let contracts in 1995 under the private finance initiative, leading to about £5 billion worth of capital investment. We said we could do it, we introduced it, and we are doing it. The growing importance of private finance has helped us to find significant savings for the taxpayer in the transport programme. Over recent years, we've seen a huge increase in public expenditure on the trunk roads and motorway programme, which has risen by 1/2 in real terms each year over the last 10 years. This was essential to tackle traffic bottlenecks and to reduce costs on British industry seeking to get goods to markets at home and abroad. Now that the main need of the economy is control of public spending and borrowing, we can't carry on pumping in the same amount of taxpayers' money. We've therefore significantly reduced the planned public spending on trunk roads and motorways. Even so, public spending on such roads, without taking account of the expected contribution from the private finance initiative, will be considerably higher in real terms than the average level of provision that we used to make in the 1980s. Rapid progress with private finance to design, build, finance and operate roads will take provision still higher, and the first 4 DBFO schemes will shortly go out to tender. Private finance will also now play an increasingly major role in London Underground investment. In particular, I'm pleased to report that the private finance competition for the provision of a new Northern Line train service has proceeded very rapidly. My right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Transport, will be able to announce a decision very soon. This, together with future deals, should improve the quality of London Underground investment as well as the quantity of investment in the Underground. In addition to the contribution from private finance, the plans in the budget imply total investment in the Underground network next financial year of around £1 billion. The budget also takes account of the key effects expected to arise from rail privatisation, not least the privatisation of Railtrack within the lifetime of this Parliament, as announced by my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Transport, last week. As has been the case with other privatisations, rail privatisation will bring benefits to passengers from more efficient management, bearing down on costs, and being more responsive to passenger needs. Mr. Deputy Speaker, private finance will play an increasingly important role in financing better infrastructure for public services in coming years. I now turn to the need for firm control of the government's current as opposed to its capital spending. One of our key objectives this year has been to intensify the search for savings on administrative and running costs. My right honourable friend, the Chief Secretary, joined the Treasury team from the Ministry of Defence, where he played last year a lead role in preparing the Defence Costs Study. That experience served him well. The success of the Defence Costs Study is just one example, a very successful example, of how key programme objectives can be protected by bearing down on the administrative costs of delivering them. The outcome has been a substantial benefit both for the taxpayer and for the front line. The defence plans in the budget fully cover the costs of the important equipment orders the Secretary of State for Defence announced in his statement to the House in July. And indeed, taking account of the changes in inflation since last year, these plans actually allow a slightly higher real terms level of spending than implied by the plan's last budget, accommodating the costs of military redundancies associated with the Defence Costs Study. Now, improvements in the efficiency of delivering services is a policy that must apply throughout the public sector. The plans in this budget reflect the results of a rigorous scrutiny of the government's own administrative costs. It must be right for modern government to modernise its own management structures and to get its own overhead costs down. As last year, we've maintained the policy that the pressure from pay and price increases should be met by greater efficiency or other economies. This has already allowed public services to achieve very reasonable pay settlements that reflect low levels of inflation and allow modest increases in real earnings. It's ridiculous to describe this long overdue and sensible practice as a pay freeze. But in total, the plans in this budget are for central government running costs not to rise in cash terms over the 4-year period from 1993 to 94 to 1997 to 98, taken as a whole. This represents a real terms reduction in those running costs of more than 10%. That's 10% from the cost of government. It's consistent with the Civil Service White Paper expectation that total civil service staff numbers will fall significantly below 500,000 over the next 4 years to their lowest levels since the war. Now, it's only right that local government should follow central government and take a similarly tough approach to containing its costs. The government's proposals for local authorities have been set on this basis. 1995 to 96, total standard spending in England will be 2.2% higher than this year, including provision for community care. That's perfectly reasonable after a year in which provision was far better than local authorities expected or that they planned for because of the government's success in reducing inflation. As in central government, local authorities will need to pursue opportunities for savings rigorously. Local authorities have substantial scope for improvements in efficiency and for other economies. And by that means, and by concentrating on their priority areas, they'll be able to protect key services. The government will use its powers to cap excessive local authority budgets should that prove necessary. My right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for the Environment, will announce the details of the local authority government settlement on Thursday. We managed to find savings in housing capital expenditure, in particular that of the Housing Corporation. The government will comfortably exceed its election manifesto commitment on the provision of new social housing up to 1994 to 95. The new plans will still allow a substantial social housing programme to continue, assisted by the corporation's success in levering in private finance. Against the background of steadily falling unemployment, it's also been possible to make economies in the employment programme while still improving the quality of the programmes that are provided. A major reform of training for unemployed adults based on payment by results will seek to ensure that more trainees get jobs when they finish their courses. Now, as a result of announcements in last year's budget, we're already down the track of a thoroughgoing reform of the Social Security benefit system. We intend to ensure that it's better targeted on today's real needs, and we intend to make it simpler and less susceptible to abuse. Legislation to reform statutory sick pay and to introduce a new incapacity benefit was enacted last session. This session will see the passage of the Job Seekers Allowance Bill and a major pensions bill to modernise the framework for both state and occupational provision. Now, tomorrow, my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Social Security, will announce the details of the next phase of this programme of social security reform. And I wish to mention now 3 of the initiatives that he will be announcing from which I expect substantial public spending savings to flow. First, housing benefit. My right honourable friend will be announcing tomorrow a reform of the arrangements through which the general taxpayer subsidises local authorities' payment of housing benefit to the tenants of private landlords. The effect of this will be that authorities will not be fully reimbursed if they pay housing benefit on rents that are significantly above the average for the area and the type of property. Local authorities will therefore scale back the benefit they actually pay in line with the new restriction on central government subsidy. They will, however, retain discretion and have some funding to pay the full rent in individual circumstances which they, the local authorities, consider justified. The previous arrangements meant that neither the landlord nor the tenant usually had any incentive at all to negotiate a lower rent, because housing benefit would usually pay the rent in full. And this has had the inevitable effect, as seems to be acknowledged, of driving up rents and public expenditure. I see I have a welcome reform, because at the moment, the Social Security budget sometimes pays the rent in full in cases where the rent's far above the average rent for property of that type in the neighbourhood. In future, people on housing benefit will have an incentive to make the same judgments about what they can afford as people who have to pay all their own rent. And the system will no longer be a prey to the unscrupulous landlord. And the reform will take effect from October 1995. Existing claimants remaining in the same property where they live now will not be affected. And my right honourable friend will be glad to hear the encouraging response that's come from the benches opposite. Secondly, let me see how far I can take the Labour Party down the process of social security reform. Secondly, my right honourable friend will be announcing tomorrow further measures to limit support for mortgage interest through the income support system, so as to constrain the cost to the taxpayer and to minimise the distortion to work incentives. Most people are readily able to insure their mortgage interest payments, if they wish, against periods of sickness or unemployment, and many people already do so. For new mortgages taken out by people of working age after October 1995, support will not normally be available for the first 9 months, although my right honourable friend will be consulting on the precise arrangements, including different treatment for circumstances in which insurance might not be available. There will also be some scaling back of support for existing borrowers. One reason why insurance hasn't become more widespread is because the taxpayer has picked up the interest bill too readily in too many cases. This change will give more borrowers an incentive to ensure that the mortgage costs of people who are temporarily unable to keep up with their payments will be met by the borrowers themselves and by lenders rather than by the taxpayer. Thirdly, my right honourable friend will also be announcing a major intensification of the war against fraud in the social security system. And we're already saving £700 million a year from our existing efforts. The further measures on fraud, which include a major project to pay benefits in post offices by electronic means rather than by paper transactions, will at a cost of £300 million save another £2.5 billion over the next 3 years. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the government know that firm control of public spending and reduced public borrowing is essential to sustained recovery, prosperity and jobs. And will also show that strong control of public spending overall can be combined with improvements in key public services selected as government priorities. The Department for Education provision will increase in real terms by almost 1% next year. The government's intent on extending its significant achievements in education, but we've also managed to find savings in parts of the education programme. Almost 1 in 3 young people are now going to university, compared with 1 in 8 in 1979. That is a remarkable achievement. A period of consolidation to secure quality and standards is now required after a period of very rapid expansion. However, the overall package of student grants and loans will once again increase in line with inflation. There will be continued growth in student numbers in further education, again to record levels. And the new plans also allow for further growth in the number of grant-maintained schools and for additional capital spending in our schools. The government continues to attach high priority to spending on law and order. The new plans for the Home Office increase provision for the police by 3% in 1995 to 96. Major efficiency improvements from the SHE proposals will enable more police officers to be released for frontline duties. And the reforms to be implemented next year will give chief constables much greater freedom to manage their own increased resources and to respond more effectively to the public's priorities. As a former minister with responsibilities for the inner cities, I'm pleased to say that within the single regeneration budget, we found extra resources to support new projects in our rundown urban areas and elsewhere. My right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for the Environment, will be providing for more projects under the current bidding round, and he'll be able to conduct a second round of bidding with funds starting in 1996 to 1997. In all, there'll be over £800 million for new regeneration projects over the next 3 years. This brings me finally on public spending to the government's plans for the health service. With inflation so much lower than expected this year than last, it would have been perfectly possible for us to reduce our previous plans for health and still to meet our manifesto commitment to real growth in resources for the National Health Service each year. Because of the high priority that we give to the National Health Service, we've decided not to claw back the unexpected provision in this way. Instead, the Health Service will keep the unplanned bonus it's had this year from lower inflation. I'll spell out what this means. This means that next year, spending on the National Health Service will grow by £1.3 billion. That's 1% growth in real terms against the 0.5% increase that we originally allowed for in last year's budget. And it will come on top of a real increase of 3.75% this year because of the drop of inflation. So in addition to the extra money from the taxpayer, the health service continues to benefit from the improvements in performance flowing from the government's reforms. Further improvements in efficiency are expected to release at least £600 million extra for patient care next year. All these savings, including gains from rationalising management and administration costs throughout the department and throughout the National Health Service, are ploughed back into patient care. And these extra funds, top of the extra provision that I've announced, the extra funds that are achieved from savings coming from a variety of measures have only one thing in common. All those savings, and therefore all the extra funds, have so far been opposed by the party opposite. But all this means, the extra provision and the savings, that next year we shall all benefit from an even better financed health service, which has seen real increases in spending upon it by the taxpayers in every year since this government took power. It will be delivering even better standards of patient care, with further improvements in patients' charter standards and more progress in reducing waiting times. Now, Mr. Deputy Speaker, at the beginning of this speech, I said the combination of healthy growth and low inflation that we're now seeing is virtually unprecedented in Britain's recent past, and few doubt the strength of the recovery. But everyone in touch with the real world knows that the benefits of recovery have yet to feed through to many people in this country. Unemployment remains far too high. Thanks to the labour market and to the trade union reforms of the 1980s, unemployment did start falling at a much earlier stage of this recovery than it had in previous recoveries. And unlike other European countries, we've resisted pressures to add social costs on top of wage costs for our employers. Unemployment will, of course, fall further as the economy recovers. But I've long believed, as my panel of independent forecasters points out, and as I think is now widely recognized, that demand expansion on its own isn't enough to produce a sufficient fall in unemployment. We have to do more to reduce unemployment in ways which are consistent with sustained growth and low inflation. Now, I've been making speeches on this, and I've been giving lectures ever since I became Chancellor on the need to ensure that we don't have recovery without jobs. But as well as giving speeches, I've already done something about it. In my last budget, I did three things. I announced measures to make it harder for people who are quite capable of working to stay on benefit without looking for a job. That's at the heart of the job seekers allowance. I made it easier for people with children to take jobs by introducing a childcare allowance into family credit. And I made it cheaper for employers to give people work by cutting the lower rates of employers' national insurance contributions by a full percentage point. Now, in this budget, I want to do more on all three fronts. We must get people back into work and out of dependency on benefit. We must reduce the cost, reduce, not increase, the cost to employers of employing people who've been out of work. And I aim to ensure that we don't have a class of people in this country who are excluded from economic activity. Now, the first step is to encourage employers to look more favorably on people who've been out of work for some time. I can announce, therefore, a wholly new incentive to encourage employers to take on more people who've been unemployed for 2 years or more. In future, employers will get a full national insurance rebate for up to a year for taking on such a person. That will provide employers with an important new reason to give a second chance to someone who's been unemployed for some length of time. You've been very late on the scene, which we've been working on for a long time, and you've got... Yeah. And you have got most of it wrong. I'm going to announce a package. Which will show you how to do it. This first year, whole year, National Insurance Contribution Holiday will run from April 1996. And more immediately, my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Employment, intends to develop new pilots under the Work Start scheme. This offers employers a grant to recruit people who've been unemployed for over 2 years. There will be around 5,000 new job opportunities. Experience with the existing pilots that we've been running suggests that the scheme helps to break down the prejudice which can blight the long-term unemployed. But I know that some employers will still worry that people who've been unemployed a long time may have lost the habit of working. We introduced the work trial scheme to counter that. It allows unemployed people to try out a new job for 3 weeks without losing their benefit, keeping their benefit entitlement. It costs employers nothing for that 3 weeks, and it lets employers see for themselves whether the people they take on can be relied on to hold down a steady job. The record so far is impressive. A large number of people are kept on at the end of the trial period. So I propose to expand the scheme to provide 150,000 job opportunities over the next 3 years. In addition, I propose a further cut in the lower rates of employers' national insurance contributions for every employee. From next April, they will come down by another 0.6%. This will reduce the cost to employers of providing lower paid jobs by another £230 million in 1995 to 96, on top of the reduction of £940 million carried through from 1994 to 95. It must make sense to keep on cutting the burden on employers who create jobs, and in particular on those employers who provide jobs for less skilled people. And the party opposite keeps wanting to go in the opposite direction by increasing costs on employers with a minimum wage and the social chapter. I need to match these incentives to employers with measures to ensure that people get the rewards to which they're entitled when they move from unemployment into work. First, we need to ensure that people are kept in touch with the labour market and don't stay on benefit unnecessarily. The job seekers allowance will reinforce the link between claiming benefit and looking for work. It will be supported by an unprecedented range of measures to help the unemployed. One of our existing measures, community action, was due to finish next year. My right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Employment, has decided to extend the scheme in revised form. It will provide work experience and a route back to jobs for about 40,000 long-term unemployed people each year. We introduced Restart when I was Minister of Employment in 1986. That required people who've been on benefit for a long time to come in for an interview and advice, help to get back into work. It gave positive help to many people and got many people back into work. It also revealed that some couldn't be bothered to come for the interview. They lost benefit. For young unemployed people, we've been experimenting with similar schemes called WorkWise and One-to-One. We propose to extend them nationwide. But it has to be worth people's while to take jobs. I also intend to introduce new measures to ensure that people aren't deterred by genuine short-term financial problems when they try to move from unemployment into work. Anyone moving from benefit into a low-paid job is likely to be better off, but it may not seem like it to the man or woman concerned. No. The first thing that happens when a person takes a new job is that income support disappears, and with it all help with the cost of housing and their council tax. In due course, the person in the new job may be entitled to family credit and to housing benefit, but at the moment it can be hard to find out how much that will be or when it will actually come. In the meantime, the person concerned has all the expenses of getting to work, buying clothes or tools, travelling to work, and so on. And time again, I've had people tell me this is a major deterrent to taking a job, and they really can't afford to take a job because of these gaps in the system. I have a number of measures to help. I propose to speed up the payment of family credit so that anyone who takes a job can be sure of getting the benefit to which they're entitled and getting it quickly. I propose to enable people who take a job to go on getting the same help with their rent and council tax as they had on income support for their first 4 weeks in the new job. I propose to speed up the payment thereafter of housing benefit so they can be quite sure where they stand at the end of the 4 weeks. I propose to exempt from tax the back-to-work bonus, which my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Social Security, announced in October. That will give people who've been unemployed but have managed to do a bit of part-time work whilst receiving their benefit to have a lump sum when they leave benefit and take a job. I also propose to expand the number of grants available to people who take jobs to cover their start-up costs. These are known as job finders grants. I propose to make available around 25,000 grants of an average of £200 for those who've been unemployed for more than 2 years. Family credit's been an important and effective way of encouraging lone parents and couples with children to take employment. By providing top-up benefit for those in work, it makes it worthwhile to give up unemployment and benefit dependency. At the moment, it helps 500,000 people. Last year, I improved family credit by announcing the new childcare allowance, which was introduced in October. I now intend to give low-paid and unemployed people with families an incentive to take full-time work. The existing structure of family credit strongly favours part-time rather than full-time working. But the majority of people who've been unemployed long-term are people who need to find full-time work. I therefore intend to introduce a £10 a week premium for full-time workers on family credit to give a new incentive to take full-time work rather than stay on benefit. This will also give a substantial boost to the incomes of 345,000 low-paid families with children. But childless couples and single people account for 2/3 of the long-term unemployed. And these people, of course, can't at present claim family credit. So I'd like to examine whether introducing a new in-work benefit for childless people would be effective. Now, this is obviously a very big step, and I've agreed with my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Social Security, that we should try it out on an experimental basis. We intend to test run a new benefit through a pilot scheme covering 20,000 people. If the pilot shows that the benefit helps to get childless couples and single people back into work, we will then consider introducing a national scheme. I've also been impressed by an imaginative scheme pioneered by the Training and Enterprise Council in Lincolnshire. This helps people build up full-time work by passing together a number of part-time jobs. Schemes known in Lincolnshire as Job Match. I propose to extend it to help up to 3,000 people a year. Now, overall, Mr. Deputy Speaker, these measures constitute an extremely important and carefully thought out package of support for unemployed people in this country. It's no longer credible for some people to campaign for reductions in long-term unemployment and to reduce benefit dependency without having effective policies to deal with it. The days of priming the pump all comes into effect steadily from this budget. The details will be announced by my right honourable friends, the Secretaries of State for Employment and Social Security. There is a Social Security statement tomorrow in the usual way. The days of priming the pump to cut unemployment are long since past. What this government is doing is building reforms on reforms to remove at last the distortions and anomalies from the benefit system which discourage so many unemployed people from taking jobs. This package aims to lift people from dependency into work and to smooth the transition from out-of-work benefits to modest in-work benefits. And the measures will work because they're carefully put together and they're affordable, and because they're being introduced at a time of strong economic recovery based on our sound economic policies so that more jobs are becoming available. They're a set of effective policies to tackle the big problem of structural unemployment which faces the whole Western world. And I believe in this country we're ahead of other countries in tackling it. And I'm sure they will eventually gain widespread support, even from those who have no practicable ideas of their own. And members opposite, I hear from their interruptions, still don't understand. If you look to the minimum wage, if you look to the social chapter, if you load costs on those employers who might otherwise create low-paid jobs, you make matters worse. We're giving incentives to create jobs and making the transition from unemployment to work easier. We started work before the Borry Commission. We've come up with better recommendations, and the Borry Commission and the Labour Party have a long way to go before they even understand how the system works. Let me turn now to my proposals for taxation. Happily, in this year's budget, I have no need to raise revenue overall in order to secure the public finances. The action in last year's budget, combined with a firm approach to public spending, will see to that. But nor, as I have already made clear publicly, are significant tax cuts justified this year. But I do have a number of proposals to ensure that we raise the necessary revenue in ways which do least damage to the economy while helping vulnerable groups. And I'm delighted that there now appears to be a wide political consensus in this House on the need to close loopholes and to prevent the artificial avoidance of taxation. There is, I have to say, in some quarters, a tendency to exaggerate the extent of tax avoidance by including proposals, as the Honourable Gentleman always does, that would actually impose extra taxes on legitimate business under the guise of a crackdown on so-called loopholes. But I've said before and demonstrated before that we're no friends to the tax avoidance industry. Last year, I announced a number of measures to close genuine loopholes, raising £2 billion over 3 years. This year, I intend to go further by tackling the artificial avoidance of VAT on property transactions and share issues, by stopping the purchase of companies simply to make use of their surplus management expenses, and by preventing tax avoidance through operations with discounted securities. And in total, the anti-avoidance measures in this budget will yield an additional £1.5 billion in the next 3 years. And we'll continue to close down genuine loopholes wherever we may find them. I have some major proposals on vehicle excise duty this year. Few things, Mr. Deputy Speaker, annoy honest motorists more than knowing that many people still drive without a tax disc and waste the time of police and the authorities in trying to track them down. Earlier this year, my right honourable friend, the former Secretary of State for Transport, announced that the government intended to move to continuous licensing. That means licensing on possession rather than the use of a vehicle. And we'll be issuing a consultation paper setting out how we intend to do this. The move's designed to combat evasion and to help fight crime by enabling the police accurately to check the ownership of vehicles. I can, however, reassure the House that we will not seek to disadvantage those motorists, including classic car owners, who don't pay vehicle excise duty now because their cars are genuinely off the road. I also intend to bring up to date the system of concessions and exemptions from vehicle excise duty. The existing highly complex arrangements go back in some cases to before the Second World War, and they have very little relevance to the modern world. The number of different concessionary classes will be reduced from 132 to 9, a simplified and sensible handful. This will come into effect from the 1st of July 1995 and will yield about £30 million a year. But the House will be pleased to hear that special treatment will still apply to cars for disabled drivers and emergency vehicles. Moreover, I've also decided that accessories for the disabled fitted in company cars will no longer be taxed as a benefit in kind from next April. I propose to increase the rate of vehicle excise duty for cars, the tax disc, by £5 to £135. But to avoid adding to industry's costs, lorry duty rates will again remain unchanged. I propose to introduce a significant change to one part of VAT relating to cars. Since 1992, taxi and car hire firms, unlike most businesses, have been able to recover the VAT on their cars. In response to the industry's concerns about market distortion, I propose to extend this to cars bought by any business wholly for business use. This will mainly affect leased cars, with consequential changes to their VAT treatment when sold or leased on. The change should be revenue neutral in the long run, but it will cost £140 million in the first year. In my last budget, I announced that road fuel duties would increase on average by at least 5% in real terms in future budgets. This year, I intend to stick to that commitment. It's an essential part of the plans that I set out last year to deliver healthy public finances as quickly as possible. It also forms an important part of the government's strategy to return carbon dioxide emissions to their 1990 level in the year 2000. From 6 o'clock this evening, petrol prices will therefore go up by 2.5 pence a litre for both leaded and unleaded petrol, taking into account the effect of VAT. In recent years, there's been a small differential between the duty on diesel and the duty on unleaded petrol. The differential is clearly becoming very difficult to justify in economic terms, in health terms, or environmental terms. I therefore propose to tax diesel at the same rate as unleaded petrol, and this means an increase of about 3 pence a litre on diesel. I also propose to increase the duty on gas, oil, and fuel oil by half a pence a litre, which will raise £70 million a year. I propose, however, to freeze the duty on road fuel gases. I turn next to duties on tobacco. The government's committed to reducing smoking, and I continue to believe that higher tax is the most effective and fair means of doing so. Last year, I said that I intended to increase tobacco duties by at least 3% in real terms on average a year. I intend to stick to that commitment today. Tax on cigarettes will therefore increase by 10 pence on a packet of 20 from 6 o'clock tonight. Duty on other tobacco products will go up by a similar proportion. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the single European market has brought real benefits to British industry. Through an expanded market for business, increased competition, reduced bureaucracy at frontiers, and cheaper transport costs. And these have or greatly benefited our consumers. But one of the most widely publicized other effects of the single market has been the increase in legitimate cross-border shopping in alcohol and tobacco and in smuggling. Both of these have inevitably meant some loss of duty to the Exchequer and pressures on the British drinks industry and some damage to British business. And no Chancellor can remain unmoved in the face of this. But neither can any Chancellor simply adopt popular measures to cut taxes on alcohol that would threaten the revenue and require taxes on other goods to be raised. In the longer term, the solution is for the government to work with our European partners to bring duties more in line. And the forthcoming review of Europe-wide minimum excise duties gives us the opportunity to make a start on this. But this year, pending that, I've once again listened to the concerns of the industry. I propose no increase in the duties on beer, table wine, and spirits. And this will mean that the proportion of the cost of an alcoholic drink represented by tax in this country will continue to fall. 10 years ago, 37% of the price of a pint of beer was taxed. Today, it's only 30%. The government also intends to modernize and deregulate betting and gaming. This process is, in my opinion, welcome and much overdue. But the coverage of taxation must also keep up to date with the modern world. I therefore propose to widen the coverage of gaming machine license duty to cover amusement machines such as arcade video games. It's anomalous that we should tax amusement machines with prizes, but not those without prizes. I'm sure this measure will be welcomed by many parents, although maybe not by all children. Gaming machine license duty has only been increased once since 1987. I propose to restore its real value to the 1987 level, but at the same time to allow payment by instalments. And these measures will raise around £60 million in a full year. In 1991, my right honourable friend, the member for Kingston upon Thames, announced a reduction in pools betting duty of 2.5%. Since then, this has helped to fund the Foundation for Sport and the Arts. My right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for National Heritage, and I have now reviewed this reduction. We've agreed that it should continue for a further 5 years, provided that the pools companies also continue to fund sport and the arts at their present level. Well, many of my honourable friends appreciate, as I do, that the Foundation continues to support a number of worthwhile projects to encourage participation in sport and the arts. And I'm delighted that the pools companies have generously reaffirmed their commitment. Mr. Deputy Speaker, a strong and thriving business community is the only way to ensure a strong and thriving economy. This government has a record of achievement in developing the tax system in ways which improve competitiveness, sharpen incentives, simplify administration, and encourage the small and medium-sized businesses which are so important to the future development of the economy. I'd like to announce a package of measures today which will add further to the strength of British industry. Decisions on many of the measures I shall be announcing today have been informed by the Industrial Finance Initiative undertaken last year by my honourable friend, the Minister of State, by my right honourable friend, the Financial Secretary, and by his predecessor. Firstly, I'd like to say a few words about corporation tax and capital allowances. We have one of the lowest corporation tax rates in the industrialised world. Low tax rates are good for incentives. They mean businesses can keep more of their profits to use as they, the businesses, want. Since 1984, we've cut the main corporation tax rate from 52% to 33%, while scaling back capital allowances to a level broadly matching commercial depreciation. I've considered again all the calls for increased allowances to encourage investment, and that they have a simplistic appeal, in my opinion. But I remain firmly of the opinion that increasing capital allowances would distort investment decisions and wouldn't encourage the high-quality investment needed to improve economic performance. A narrower tax base which it would produce would also jeopardize our ability to maintain the low tax rates which have helped to transform British industry over the last decade. The change made by my right honourable friend, former right honourable friend, now Lord Lawson, from high capital allowances to low rates of corporation tax has been very successful. I propose to maintain that emphasis on low rates for the successful rather than high allowances for all in our system of business taxes. I also have no changes to announce on the rate of advanced corporation tax or the value of the tax credit on dividends. But I would now like to deal with business rates. We're about to implement the first 5-yearly review of valuations of properties for rating purposes. If we didn't have these 5-year reviews, the rate base will become hopelessly out of date. And the property market's changed a lot over the past 5 years with wide regional variations. As a result of the review, many properties in the south of England from now on will begin to see reductions in their rate bills. Some businesses in the Midlands, the North, Scotland and Wales will benefit as well. But others in those regions will discover that up-to-date valuations will raise their liability. Now, I'm glad to say that I will be able to continue to find resources to help businesses through this new transition period in the same way that we've been helping business through the transition from the last revaluation. My right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for the Environment, my right honourable friends, the Secretaries of State for Scotland and Wales, will announce details of the new scheme later today. But I can tell the House now that increases in bills will be limited to 10% in any one year for large properties once adjusted for inflation. Small business properties account for 3/4 of those receiving protection, and we've decided to limit real increases for such properties to 7.5%. This protection will in part be financed by limiting real reductions in rates bills for large properties to 5% and for small properties to 10% in any one year. But the revenue from limiting gains isn't enough to help those businesses who happen to find themselves worse off as a result of more up-to-date valuations. I've therefore decided to provide revenue assistance of £605 million next year to finance the transitional relief, similar to the amount we were spending on the former transitional relief scheme this year. I laid stress at the beginning of this speech on our improved export performance. We need to build on this and not become complacent. Strong export growth will be essential if healthy recovery is to be sustained. My right honourable friend, the President of the Board of Trade, and I have taken a closer look at the services provided by the Export Credit Guarantee Department. We've agreed that a reduction in premiums of around 10% on average is possible, while still protecting taxpayers' interests. Therefore, propose to make that reduction in premiums. It will improve our competitiveness, building on the premium reductions in the last 2 years. Furthermore, we've agreed to increase the amount of ECGD cover available to many important developing markets by £300 million from 1997 to 98. Those measures will provide an added incentive for British exporters to play an even greater role in the most successful, rapidly growing economies in the world. As I said earlier, one of my main objectives for the tax system is that it should raise revenue in ways which do the least possible damage to the economy. In some cases, taxes can actually do some good by helping markets work better and by discouraging harmful or wasteful activities. Taxes can play an important role in protecting the environment. And one major problem in this country is the disposal of waste. And I would like to make an announcement today to help tackle this problem. My right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for the Environment, and I will issue shortly a consultation paper setting out details of a new tax to be collected by Customs and Excise on waste disposed in landfill. We propose that a new landfill tax should come into effect in 1996, and it should raise several £100 million a year. But I'm determined not to impose additional costs on business overall. I shall therefore be looking at ways when we raise the revenue to offset the impact of the new tax by making further compensatory reductions in the level of employer national insurance contributions when the new tax is introduced. In brief, what I'm proposing is to raise tax on polluters to make further cuts in the tax on jobs over and above the taxes I've already reduced. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I have more measures to help small businesses in particular. The need to focus on smaller firms with growth potential has been an extremely important theme of the Industrial Finance Initiative. It's absolutely essential that we have a healthy and vigorous small firm sector in this country for the future economic well-being of the country and to achieve higher levels of employment. Now, one important way in which we can help small businesses is by encouraging the venture capital industry. A flourishing venture capital industry plays a key role in promoting job creation, innovation, and growth. And the British venture capital industry has been growing in recent years, and I'm determined that are aimed at encouraging equity investment in small companies, and I want to build on them today. The new enterprise investment scheme is now already in place, offering tax relief for investment in unquoted trading companies. Over 40% of the scheme set up so far involve so-called business angels who want to invest their own personal expertise as well as their money in a small growing business. That's a good start, but the scheme's got some complex rules, and I have decided to simplify them. I'm also extending capital gains tax reinvestment relief to the enterprise investment scheme, which should increase still further its attractiveness. I've consulted widely on venture capital trusts, and the response has been very positive. I've accepted suggestions for change on some details, and I propose to implement the scheme in full. But I want to go further by making investment through these trusts in risk capital even more attractive than I originally contemplated when I announced the consultation period. Investment up to £100,000 a year in new shares in a venture capital trust will therefore offer 20% upfront income tax relief and capital gains tax reinvestment relief, in addition to tax-free dividends and capital gains. I believe that venture capital trusts will make a successful contribution to filling a gap in our enterprise economy by encouraging more people to become venture capitalists. The cost of the new scheme, venture capital trusts, is expected to be £150 million next year, rising to £290 million in 1996-97. Of course, those costs have to be based on an estimate of the take-up, but we expect considerable take-up. It could mean that funds of £2.5 billion might be raised over the next 3 years, providing much more investment where it is most needed in our small, growing, technologically advanced and innovative companies. My proposals go significantly beyond what I first set out 12 months ago, and they now put in place an effective and imaginative set of measures aimed at generating equity investment in dynamic, innovative, growing businesses. They should be widely welcomed by everyone who understands how a modern free market economy works and how new jobs are created in the modern world. Unlike some honourable members, I don't describe tax reliefs of this kind to stimulate investment in business and enterprise as tax loopholes, which they're usually identified as by the honourable gentleman. During the recent recession, insolvent businesses, particularly small businesses, were too often being closed down by their creditors and jobs lost before rescue options have been properly explored. Following consultation, my right honourable friend, the President of the Board of Trade, will shortly issue a paper setting out the government's main conclusions on company rescue procedures in future. To give management more time to reorder their affairs, we'll introduce a 28-day moratorium binding on all parties. This will give companies a breathing space to assess rescue prospects and try to come to an arrangement with their creditors. We're also consulting further on a mechanism to help substitute equity for debt of firms in administration or receivership. And I hope these measures will contribute further to the creation of a rescue culture, discouraging the needless and wasteful liquidation of businesses that could become sound. The impact of the 1993 changes to the loan guarantee scheme has been encouraging, but its rules are still quite rightly being criticised as too complex. Together with my right honourable friend, the President of the Board of Trade, I intend to review these rules with a view to making the scheme simpler and more attractive. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the tax system not only imposes the financial burdens on business who pay the tax, but also a regulatory burden and an overhead cost as well. And I want to reduce those burdens on businesses. Simply running PAYE and national insurance contributions is difficult for many small businesses. From next April, I propose to increase by more than 30% the threshold for businesses to make quarterly rather than monthly payments to the Inland Revenue. Now, this will benefit around 100,000 employers at a one-off one-year cost of £75 million. This means that nearly two-thirds of all employers in the country will now be able to make quarterly payments of their PAYE. I also propose to consult on a move towards annual VAT payments to small traders and to further simplification of VAT accounting. Furthermore, I intend to improve the administration of the tax system by encouraging closer working between the two revenue departments, Inland Revenue and Customs and Excise, as well as closer cooperation between the Inland Revenue and the Contributions Agency. This will all be directed at improving the service offering to business seeking to comply with their tax obligations. I'd also like to make some progress towards closer alignment of tax and national insurance. From next April, clearances given by the Inland Revenue concerning non-taxable expenses will also count for national insurance purposes. And my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Social Security, will give details of this and other measures in his statement tomorrow. I also intend to raise the registration threshold for value-added tax to £46,000 tomorrow in line with inflation. So that will help a number of the smaller businesses. Finally, I turn to self-assessment. I'm publishing today for consultation some details of the remaining legislation for self-assessment. The Inland Revenue has been consulting very widely on the changes. The response has been positive, worthwhile reform to aim for. My right honourable friend, the Financial Secretary, and I intend to go ahead with our proposals and aim to keep any burden placed on employers as low as possible. Now, taken together, this latest extensive package, tax reliefs and deregulatory measures, provide a very substantial package of support for the business community. They aim to strengthen British businesses not by intervention, but by easing cash flow problems, by cutting back red tape and providing targeted help for small businesses. That's how we maintain our improved business performances, help sustain the recovery, and help to create more jobs. Mr. Deputy Speaker, higher savings also have an important role to play in helping sustain growth by providing additional resources for investment. Deputy Honourable Gentlemen, this budget contains extremely serious matters to deal with helping small business, cutting in employment, producing all the real improvements in the economy the people of this country actually want. And I'm now turning to savings. I've already announced measures to encourage savings into unquoted companies. There are two further measures I'd like to announce today. Personal equity plans have been very successful since their introduction in 1986. Over £15 billion has been invested in over 4 million plans to date. They've widened share ownership, and they've played an important role in providing finance to industry. I want to take that success further, and in particular, to widen the type of finance available to industry through PEPs. I propose that from next year, people will be able to invest through PEPs in a range of corporate bonds, convertibles and preference shares, and not simply equities. This change is expected to cost £10 million in 1995 to 96, rising to £40 million in 1997 to 98. Still on savings, when my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, introduced tax-exempt special savings accounts, or TESAs as they came to be called, it was understood that tax-free interest would be allowed to build up over a 5-year period. Some of those accounts, the 5-year period will soon be coming to an end. I've had to consider whether this tax exemption for savings should be extended. TESAs have been very popular, allowing many people to catch the savings habit to build a nest egg for their future. Over 4 million people have invested over £20 billion since they were first introduced. Given their success for popularity, I've decided that all or part of the capital accumulated in the TESA at maturity can be reinvested straight away in a new TESA. Anyone who wants to continue to save tax-free will therefore be able to do so up to an overall limit of £9,000. This measure will cost £150 million in 1996 to 97. Finally, I turn from taxation to income tax. The lower, basic and higher rates of income tax will remain unchanged in 1995 to 1996. However, we can at last begin to benefit from our steady return to healthy public finances. This means I can fully index the personal allowance, the threshold for higher rate tax, and the income limit for the age-related allowance. But I've been able to provide some additional help in two important areas. First, I want to do a little bit more for pensioners. I propose to increase the age-related personal allowance by more than indexation. The allowances for everyone aged 65 and over will be increased by £430. Nearly 3 million pensioners will gain from this at a cost of £200 million in a full year. I also propose to widen the 20p lower band to £3,200. That increase is twice the amount necessary for indexation for inflation. 1 in 5 of all taxpayers will now only pay tax at the lowest rate of 20 pence. The tax measures I'm announcing in this budget, all the tax measures I've described, reduced revenue by £1 billion in 1995 to 1996. But that's because I've had to provide £605 million, as I said, for the transitional relief for business ratepayers. I've said many times that I'd like to go further, and that I will, in due course, go further. We on this side of the House are tax cutters by instinct. But I have also made clear over and over again that tax cuts can only come when we can afford them and when it's in the interest of our industrial economy that we should make them. That means two things. We've got to continue to improve further our long-term economic performance. That's why in my budget today I've introduced numerous measures, boring the honourable gentleman for bowls over, strengthening the economy and making sure that recovery is sustained and we become a powerful manufacturing and industrial economy. The second requirement is firm control of public spending. All my efforts to help businesses and to help the unemployed will be to no avail if I didn't keep a firm grip on public spending. I've already dealt with spending by each department, but I've not yet described what will happen to public spending overall as a result of our decisions. Last year's spending round delivered substantial cuts in overall public spending. This year's hasn't been easy because of that. Public spending control is not only about controlling costs, it's about choice of priorities. That is the language of politics. Within this year's settlement, my right honourable friend, the Chief Secretary, and I have succeeded in producing real increases in resources for priority programmes such as the National Health Service and the Police Service. We've also managed to protect the delivery of public services generally by focusing our search for savings on administrative costs. We've avoided our tight settlement last year being turned into a wasteful one by ensuring that success in lowering inflation doesn't simply increase the volume of spending on programs. But I'm glad to tell the House that this approach has allowed us to make overall savings which are even greater than those achieved last year. Last year, we managed to reduce the control total by £8 billion over the 3 years. This year, we've done a bit better. Not 10, not 15, not 20, but another £24 billion off the control total over the next 3 years on top of last year's reduction. Last year, we reduced public spending plans so as to reduce general government expenditure by £15 billion over a 3-year period. This year, on top of last year's reductions, we will reduce general government expenditure by £28 billion. This is a total reduction in government expenditure over the 4 years covered by my 2 budgets of £43 billion. These savings have allowed me to reduce my projection for the public sector borrowing requirements. Taking into account the tax and public spending measures, I now expect to be able to reduce borrowing from £30 billion to £21.5 billion in 1995 to 96, from the previously forecast £21 billion to £13 billion in 1996 to 97, and from £12 billion to £5 billion the year after that. This reduced borrowing should provide an added stimulant to business confidence, strengthen the recovery further, and give us the healthy public finances we need to put our economy and our economic policy on course. This budget keeps Britain firmly on track for real economic growth that can last. This budget concentrates on strengthening British businesses. This budget will help to create more jobs, and it will lay the foundations for sustained rises in prosperity. I commend it, Mr. Deputy Speaker, to the House.
So the Chancellor sits down after a long and very detailed budget statement. Dennis Skinner from Bolsover are complaining that one person on the other side was asleep, but I'm not allowed to say they're asleep because we're not allowed to say that. But anyway, it was a long and detailed statement. We'll have the full details of it later on, but let's just see the main elements that were contained in it. First of all, on that much argued about 17.5% on fuel, he introduced a new compensation package for the pensioner on fuel, and also extra cold weather payments in the coming year for pensioners, and national insurance rebates. This was moving on to jobs, which was the other main element of this. National insurance rebates for employing the long-term unemployed. There were a lot of measures in this budget for trying to get people who've been out of work for 2 years or more back into work. So there are complicated proposals there. Then coming to income tax, the rates, the three bands are unchanged, but the 20% band is actually widened at the 20% rate. It's widened to 3,200. So he said 1 in 5 people now would only pay tax at 20%. Allowances for those over 65 were increased above the index rate by £430. Everybody else's allowances were indexed, which they weren't last year. And then on the excise duties and car tax, car road tax goes up £5. That's just indexing to £135. Diesel went up a bit more than expected, 0.5 a litre. Petrol goes up, as he predicted it would, by 2.5, 2.5 pence per litre. And unleaded petrol gets the same increase this time. Cigarettes get hit. Cigarettes go up 10 pence, and beer, spirits and wine, there's no change. Now Tony Blair, the Leader of the Opposition.
Living standards. Secondly, the degree to which it reduces social injustice and cuts unemployment. And thirdly, its impact on the long-term economic strength of the country. Mr. Deputy Speaker, we have seen the reaction on the benches opposite, the cheers, but I suspect there will be two distinct views of this budget. One is the Conservative politicians' view on the benches opposite, and the other is the view in the homes and the workplaces and the streets of this country. Because whatever is said by the Chancellor, this will go down in history as the VAT on fuel budget. And let me deal straight away. Yes. Mr. Deputy Speaker, it only shows how out of touch the party opposite are. If they don't think the question people are asking and will be asking tonight is why the Chancellor didn't take the chance to live up to his election promise. Now let me deal straight away then with his compensation proposals. And let's just see how generous these compensation proposals really are. As I understand it, there are only two parts to it. First of all, the social fund cold weather payments. They will only apply, of course, when the temperature is very low and to certain groups of people. There are many, many groups to which it will not apply at all. And as for the home energy efficiency scheme, let's just make clear exactly how much this is. It's the £10 million set against the £2.7 billion that he is raising as a result of VAT. And furthermore, let's just make this clear as well, that he announced what he said was very generous: retirement, pension, health. In actual fact, I think I'm right in saying, when you look at the figures, that in fact it is only the normal RPI plus the compensation already announced. And indeed, even what he was announcing earlier about the extension of help for old age pensioners amounts, on average, to about 10 pence a week or £6 a year. So set against that, how can this possibly compensate for the enormous rise in VAT? From next April, the bills of every single person, the fuel bills, will rise by 10%. That is on top of the price rises, on top of the 8% VAT already levied. And let us just remind the party opposite. In fact, we will not cease of reminding them this. They fought the last general election on the specific pledge that they would never raise VAT. They've broken it, and they will never be trusted on tax again. Now, let me tell honourable members opposite as well, there will be a chance that this side of the House will give for this House to speak for the people of this country. When we table an amendment that will allow members of Parliament to vote on this rise, we will challenge all members of the party opposite, both parties opposite, all members of them, to keep their promise to the electorate upon which they were elected. And if they break that promise, then the country has been warned that the Conservative Party put VAT on fuel and power when it promised it wouldn't, and it cannot be trusted not to put VAT on food, on children's clothing, on books, on papers, if they're ever elected again. And then, of course, that's not the end of the tax rises that he didn't mention in his budget. Next April, mortgage tax relief is to be cut down to 15%. Again, a breach of a specific manifesto pledge. And then there's the married couples allowance. Next April, again, it will go up. Again, never mentioned by the Chancellor, down to 15%. Car insurance tax and home insurance tax. And all this on top of last year's taxes and this year's taxes. In 2 years, a sting of almost £1,000 a year for the average British family. 7 pence on the standard rate of income tax. That is the betrayal the British people will never forget. Now, in many of the interviews the Chancellor has given recently in what used to be described as budget purdah, he was honest enough to confess that he has, and I quote, delivered very little to Mr. and Mrs. Smith up and down the country. Now, I believe this is a reference to what Conservative Central Office calls the elusive feel-good factor. It was referred to in the now notorious Maples report. Now, I'll tell honourable members opposite why there's no feel-good factor. I'll tell them why Mr. and Mrs. Smith do not feel good, because Mr. and Mrs. Smith feel bad about what this government has done. They feel bad because their mortgage tax relief has been cut by a government that promised it wouldn't. They feel bad because it costs more to drive or insure their car or insure their home or to take a holiday. They feel bad because they have to pay the VAT on fuel and sickened that their elderly relatives have to pay it too. There is a real world out there, and it is a mile away from what the Chancellor described. It is a world of mass unemployment, temporary contracts, enforced part-time working. It is a world where this is the world in which people live, and these are the tax rises that are going to hit them next year. It is a world where one job may often not be enough to make ends meet. It is a world in which living standards will fall as a result of this budget, in which crime and the fear of crime has risen, in which the transport system has ceased to serve them, and in which the National Health Service has been sacrificed on the altar of the free market. Now, and as living standards are fallen, they see the results of social decay and injustice all around them. Now, let me come to the Chancellor's so-called budget for jobs measures. Today he talked, well, we'll analyze and see just how much they actually amount to as against the problem. Now, he talked today of a deprived underclass. And I think there are many, many people in this country who hold this government responsible for 15 years in which that has happened. Now, he claims that his measures were very generous. I have to tell him that his national insurance holiday after 2 years of unemployment is actually what this side asked for, but for 1 year. But we'll leave that to one side. If, however, of course we welcome it, but why didn't he take up the other alternative that we proposed, which is a proper tax rebate on national insurance and elsewhere for employers that would have allowed us to get substantial numbers of the long-term unemployed back to work? Now, he said there was a big expansion of community action. In actual fact, as I understand it, there are 57,000 people on community action this year. It's actually going to be reduced next year to 40,000. The only increase is over last year's plan, not the actual amount of people that are there. I think that is right. Furthermore, he's announced an extension of the... Furthermore, Mr. Deputy Speaker, furthermore, I think I'm right in saying that the numbers of people, unemployed people who are going to be assisted, are actually going to be assisted from a reduced budget. Now, that is actually the case, as I understand it. Yeah. Because what actually happens, if we look at the press release that's just been issued by the Department of Employment. Entirely justifiable slip. It says we will increase the number of unemployed people who get jobs as a result of the program from a reduced budget. So this generous help does not appear on analysis to be quite so generous as he said. On any basis, the problem of the long-term unemployed will remain. Now, he says he can't find more money for it, but let me tell him one or two things he could have done. Now, today, he actually said that he could take action on certain of these loopholes, these things he used to dismiss so abusively in the years gone by. Now, suddenly, he can find, I think it was 1.5 billion over 3 years. But let me tell him some of the other loopholes he could have closed down. Why couldn't he have acted against executive share options and the abuse of those? Why couldn't he have withdrawn the tax relief for private medical assurance, £100 million a year that goes into that? And let me just tell him, because this illustrates the choices between the two parties. That in itself would have been enough to kickstart a proper program such as we describe for the long-term unemployed. Offshore trusts, the abuse of inheritance tax, where ordinary families are getting penalized, but those at the very top end of the income scale aren't. Or indeed, the abuses in the privatized utilities. Now, the national grid was valued at 1.5 billion. It's now worth 4.5 billion. That increase has not been earned. It is a windfall increase. It is of the same order for the company as these pay rises and top salary increases are at the very top. And yet, at the bottom of the heap, due to long-term unemployment, there are families and children in this country who are becoming so poor that in certain areas mortality rates are rising and there is malnutrition among some of our children. Now, let me tell him, whilst any of these, whilst there is a single possibility of raising money properly through closing abuses, we say it is intolerable in this budget to leave unchecked gross abuses of the tax system, or to refuse to ensure that its burdens and advantages are more fairly distributed when there are families living at or near the breadline in this country today. But indeed, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the injustice is not just at the expense of those that are poor. One of the most interesting reports published just in the last couple of weeks was from the Institute of Fiscal Studies, and it was a report of the tax changes, the impact of them on ordinary families between 1985 and 1995. Now, that is actually to be generous to the government, taking it over that period, because you leave out the increases in value-added tax in 1979 that they brought in breach of their promise not to do so. But if you take the 10 years, 85 to 95, what does that actually show? This is what we have made all these sacrifices for. It shows that the bottom 40% of the population have actually lost as a result of those tax changes. A further 20% have barely gained, so a majority have either lost or stayed about still. And it is only the top 10% that have gained really substantial sums of money. And they have gained over 5 times the amount of the next percentage down. Now that is actually what has happened. And indeed, that is despite the huge proceeds of oil, of sales of assets, which taken together, those proceeds of oil and assets amount to £8,000 per family in Britain. I tell you, they could have given that money to families, put it in the building society and done better than they've done out of this government.
Well, Tony Blair, starting his reply, that dreadful business of getting up immediately after the Chancellor has sat down and spoken for an hour and a half and having to extract from what he said an argument for the opposition, which he was doing rather creditably. The second tranche of that is actually done by the Shadow Chancellor tomorrow, when he's had a full chance to look at the details of these budget proposals that Kenneth Clarke has introduced. But anyway, that is the start of Labour's reply to what Kenneth Clarke has done. Let's now turn back to Kenneth Clarke's budget itself and see what the principal measures were, and then we'll have a look at how your tax will be affected, and also a look at how your housekeeping budget will be affected by the measures announced. Let's just go through, first of all, the main measures. The beginning of it, the state of the economy, the GDP, the gross domestic product, that's the scale of spending and manufacturing of the country as a whole, its whole economic health, is growing at 3.25% next year. It's a slight slowdown from this year. Balance of payments, according to the Chancellor, is going to improve by £6 billion this year. Britain's exports are strong. Inflation would remain between 1% and 4%, but it's going to peak at the end of the coming year at 2.5%. He talked about the government borrowing, which is the crucial element in getting taxation down, and in political terms, getting it down before the next election. And there's the picture of what the government is borrowing. 34.5 billion this year, 21.5 billion next, then down to 13 billion, and then down to 5.5 billion in 97-8. These are all, of course, Treasury plans. It may not work out like that, but that's what they think is going to happen. And then on income tax, the rates don't change. The 20% band, which is the lowest band, which was introduced by Mr. Lamont, is increased, the scale of it, the band on which you pay it is increased to £3,200. 1 in 5 taxpayers now will only pay 20% income tax. There's extra allowances for the over 65s. They go up by £430, but all other allowances are indexed, which they weren't last time round. On fuel, there's changes on the compensation package for VAT on fuel, which Tony Blair was being scathing about, you heard a moment ago, which is increasing the amount that the elderly receive to make up for the 17.5% VAT on domestic fuel, which is going ahead. Extra £10 million for home insulation grants. Cold weather payments are increased to £8.50 a week. Though it doesn't look like there's going to be much cold weather yet this winter. On there's the one-off payment to pensioners as compensation for VAT on fuel. Extra £52 for single pensioners, 73 for couples in 95-6. There are the details of it. £68 for single pensioners, 96 for couples in 96-97. That's to set against the 17.5% on fuel. Transport. The road tax, VED as it's called, goes up £5 to £135. That's just in line with inflation. Diesel up rather more than inflation by 3p on a litre, or 3p on a litre, I should say. Petrol up 2.5p on a litre. That's 6 o'clock tonight. Unleaded petrol, the same increase, 2.5%, 2.5p rather, a litre. On alcohol, no change at all. Make the Chancellor popular in the run-up to Christmas. No change on beer, no change on wine or spirits. He said this was because there'd been a lot of talk about how people were going abroad, going to the continent to buy their drink, and he couldn't actually bring the two in line with each other in terms of duty, but he thought it was fair to make no change for the moment. Cigarettes, on the other hand, get the full whack that he promised last budget, up 10p for a packet of 20 cigarettes. Changes on business taxation, no alteration for corporation tax rates. A lot of talk about the rate bills for businesses in the southeast and businesses elsewhere, and various rather complicated proposals for making sure that the increases where they were falling due in the north, for instance, would be limited in percentage terms to 10%, so there wouldn't be a sudden change in the rates of business rates that are paid. VAT threshold, the level at which you have to start paying VAT, up to £4,000 to £6,000. On savings, PEPs, personal equity schemes, extended to all kinds of other investment which you weren't allowed to put your money into before. You will now be allowed to put it into preference shares, for instance, or government stock. And TESAs, the scheme that was introduced by John Major when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer, which are running out now for the first 5 years they've had of up to £9,000 receiving interest tax-free from your building society. That's to be extended. You can now put it in for another 5 years. Now, the Chancellor made great play with his proposals for getting particularly the long-term unemployed back to work. First of all, a rebate for employing long-term unemployed. For the first year, you wouldn't pay, the employer, that is, wouldn't pay any national insurance at all for somebody who'd been out of work for 2 years. And the reduction in the employer's national insurance rate at the lower level, not affecting the higher level, the 10.2%, but at the lower level, a 0.6% reduction. So again, just affecting lower paid workers. And then a scheme to try and provide 150,000 jobs in work trials, building on a scheme he already has. And for the unemployed, a new £10 a week bonus for full-time workers on family credit. There's been a lot of criticism of the way family credit works when people try and go back into work and lose family credit very rapidly as they start earning, and also with delays in the payment and the various social security benefits that are received, that he also plans to address to try and speed up the pace at which you can move from one kind of social security to another when you go out of unemployment into low-paid employment. On government spending, he announced increases, as seen there. National Health Service, he increases it by 1%. He said he could have saved money on the health service because of the falling level of inflation, which has released more money, but he decided instead to leave it all there in the health service. Education spending goes up 1%, spending on the police up 3% next year. Big cutbacks in government spending on trunk roads, an extra £1 billion for the London Underground, but overall more than £1 billion saved on transport, and 800 million for inner city regeneration over 3 years. Those are the government spending plans. A fairly modest restriction in government spending. I think it came out at 6.9 billion cutback, and 6 billion of that is attributable to growth, unexpectedly high growth, and to unexpectedly low inflation. So not a particularly painful cutback, and indeed the Chancellor has been presenting it, you can see, as a sort of improvement in government spending, increases in government spending. And in fact, during that statement, a lot of the time he was getting nods from the opposition side when he seemed to be stealing their clothes. There's a certain amount of political transvesticism going on. And now let's have a look at how you'll actually be affected. Tax, first of all. Peter.
Right, your income tax then, just the direct tax effect of the Chancellor's measures today, not including all those ones in the pipeline for next April, already pre-planned by the Chancellor, just the effect of today's speech. Here they are, quite small, the indexing of allowances and the widening of that lower rate tax band, 42 pence a week. This is the weekly effect, the weekly bonus you get, if you like, the weekly tax cut. At £5,000 a year person, 42 pence a week more. Then as we go up into people paying on the lower rate band, that band between north and 3,200 of taxable income at 20% now, a 69% bonus for them right the way up, 7,500 a year, 10,000, 13,000, 17,000, that's roughly average earnings there, 69 pence a week better off. And then the raising of the higher threshold, the moment at which we start paying 40% tax, means that 92 pence a week better off is the bonus for people on those salaries way up there, 30, 50, and 100,000. That's the direct tax effect. We'll be looking at a moment at how people will be affected overall when you allow indirect taxation balanced against that.
Thanks very much, Peter. Well, now let's have a look at this budget and what you all around this table think of it. Peter J, first of all, because you were kicking off on what the Chancellor could do. What do you make of what he's done, what he's actually achieved?
I think it's a triumph for the unified budget, because if it had not been unified, bringing together the traditional tax budgets from the spring and the traditional autumn statement on spending in the autumn, he would have had nothing to say at all. The whole of the announced change in the government's deficit, the reduction of £8 billion, is on the spending side. About £5 billion of that is simply the direct automatic consequence of the fact that inflation is lower than was assumed a year ago when the figures were prepared. Most of the rest of it is due to the rather faster expansion of the economy, rather lower level of unemployment, the lower cost, therefore, of unemployment benefits. as we were saying before he stood up, this is a budget about waiting for next year. He has kept all of his powder, if that's what it should be called, dry. He's not used a significant penny of it for any political purpose this year. All of it will be there next year. The budget deficit is smaller than a year ago he thought it was because the economy has recovered more rapidly. That does not create in economic terms any scope for cutting taxes, which is no doubt why he didn't cut taxes. When he gets to the point next year of actually cutting taxes, which he will do quite substantially, he will then have a job to explain how the economic arithmetic has changed in such a way as to make that possible. But the real reason will be that the tax increases which were announced last year were rather more than was strictly required.
We're getting reaction coming in while you're speaking on the screen. In unison, health service workers are saying that the budget will mean a reduction in health services. Why should that be if he's put in increases of $3 billion on their previous plans? Seems rather obscure point.
I'm not privy to their arithmetic. On the face of it, he was saying that he was going to keep the same sum as he announced, the same cash figure in the health budget for next year as was previously penciled in for next year, and that since inflation was lower, i.e. each pound buys more, that amounted to a 1% real increase. That appears to be correct economic logic to me.
Right, well, we'll come back. I'll ask you next, John Whiting, about this. But Robin Oakley's just joined us from Westminster and was in there listening to the budget speech. You fall asleep, Robin, or do you stay awake?
Stayed awake, but most Tory MPs, I think, will feel that it's very much a jam tomorrow budget and not the kind of jam today that will take their minds off the internal troubles in the Tory party. Very much bits and pieces, this budget. I'm sure that will be the political reaction when I get some time to spend in the lobby. But we've just had a very impressive intervention from Tony Blair, I think, possibly his best performance in the Commons since he became Labour's leader. It's always a very difficult task, picking up immediately on the back of a budget like this. He went straight for the Tory jugular on the question of VAT on fuel and said immediately that Labour would make this a highlight and that they'd give the Tory rebels a chance to vote on this to have a go at the Tories for their broken promises on VAT on fuel.
Yes, we carried that, and we also carried earlier the Prime Minister saying in Prime Minister's questions that the vote on VAT, the 17.5% on fuel, wasn't at all like the European vote. What did he mean by that?
Well, he meant that he's clearly not going to make it a vote of confidence with the government's future hanging on it. I don't think we'll see any threat by Mr. Major that if the Tories should be defeated on VAT, that he'll be off to the palace demanding a dissolution and threatening a general election.
So it's not true that finance measures are matters of confidence for a government then?
Well, that's
changing the British Constitution.
Yes, that's where the government are getting themselves in a little bit of a tangle, because that was one of the arguments that was used over the European Communities Bill, that it was a financial measure as well as a treaty obligation.
Anything in particular in that budget that you saw Tory backbenchers applauding or seeing a sort of relief from? Or did they just sit grimly through it, listening to all the details and trying to make head or tail of it?
For the most part, they sat grimly through it, but I think they were heartened by the figures at the end that the Chancellor was giving in terms of the cutback in government borrowing and spending. I think they were genuinely impressed with the size of those figures. They were bigger than expected, and they do carry for many Tories the imprint of tax cuts to come next year and the year after. But this certainly begins to look like a government that will attempt to run the full term through all its troubles.
Thank you very much, Robin. Father Christmas is ambling along behind you, so I'll leave you to go and get your present from him. And thanks for joining us. John Whiting, on the tax front then, what are the key changes that people are going to be affected by? Is there anything really significant or important or any new directions in taxation?
There's not a lot, as we rather suspected. It's a bit of tinkering as much as anything. Certainly Father Christmas hasn't been pulling things out of his sack yet. I think there is some worthwhile tinkering for business, fairly subtle, but promises of strange things, perhaps, like the revenue and customs cooperating more, helping on the admin, helping on venture capital trusts and enterprise investment schemes. But it's interesting, isn't it, that one man's investment incentive is another man's loophole, which the opposition seized on. But he's trying to help the creation of new jobs with things like that. And also, of course, this smoothing of people back into work.
Okay, fine. Thank you very much. Let's find out what the CBI and the TUC thought of it. Clive Thompson.
Well, we asked for a budget for sustained economic growth, and I think we probably got it. We also asked a budget for jobs and for business, and I think we got that too. There was no net tax reduction, which was what we wanted. There was no increase in business taxes, which seemed fine. and there were some genuine efforts to help employment and small businesses. On the employment front, we saw some supply side changes, encourage people to take jobs, perhaps an extension of the Work Start projects, which we've seen in various parts of the country, encourage employers by reducing the cost of employment to take those people on.
He was scathing about your plan for having more tax allowances for investment.
Well, I think the big question
So
on
you all
employment is...
thought that was necessary, but it wasn't.
Well, that's been something the CBI have been on for years. But going back to employment, the big question is, will these measures increase the number of jobs available? And I think only time will tell. But going to the points on business, we didn't get anything, as you say, on capital allowances. We're pleased about the transitional relief on business rates, pleased about the export credit guarantee movements, interested on the landfill tax, environment tax, which will stimulate people to incinerate waste.
Okay, we'll come back to you, John Monks, in a moment, because I want to go to Bharti Patel of the low pay unit, who's down in Westminster, I think. What do you make of these changes, particularly as they affect people coming back into work from being unemployed, and encouraging employers and also trying to change social security arrangements to make it easier? Are they going to be effective?
Okay, of course they are going to be effective. The Chancellor quite actively promotes the creation and the growth of low-paid employment, which is disgraceful because low-paid employment hasn't helped the economy anywhere at all. It has never, ever encouraged people to spend more, and therefore acted to the opposite, in the opposite direction. But let me just look at the housing benefit aspect of it. The social security changes that the Chancellor announced, the reduction in housing benefits, payments to local councils, is going to have some very serious repercussions, not only to low-paid workers who rely on housing benefits for adequate housing, but also on low-income households. And basically, it will lead to greater homelessness by people having to leave the accommodation that they're in.
But I don't want to interrupt you, but it seemed to be rather approved of on the opposition benches on the grounds that landlords and their tenants were just paying any amount of rent, knowing that the council would repay it. And the theory of it was that actually people would negotiate their rents downwards. You don't think that will happen?
Sure. If we were living in the real world, that certainly would be ideal, that if local councils could negotiate and reduce the rents of lower paid and lower income households, then that would be fine. But in reality, in practice, what will happen is that more and more people will be forced to look for unsuitable accommodation because the housing benefit is not adequate, and that will lead to homelessness. You need adequate housing for these things to happen.
Right.
We haven't got that.
Can we come back to the business of employment, which obviously the Chancellor set great store by? You say he's trying to get people to move into low-paid jobs. He would say he's trying to get people out of unemployment into work and to make that process easier. Do you think it's not going to be easier? Or do you just object to the wages people get paid when they get into work?
No, we don't reject it. It isn't going to be easier because of the poverty trap that people are in. Once you take up a low-paid employment, you get clawed, your money gets clawed back through benefit system. So, for instance, if you're claiming family credit, for every pound increase that you earn through your income, you lose 70p. So it isn't actually going to make the process any easier. If anything, it'll put people into a poverty trap and decrease the incentive to get back into work.
Bharti Patel, thank you very much indeed. John Monks, do you agree with that? Do you think these measures are not going to achieve anything, or do you think they are the kind of thing you were looking for?
Well, I think there are a range of small-scale measures which will have a very limited impact. And this idea of the national insurance holiday, we're talking about 1996 as the introductory the date for it. So that is certainly jam tomorrow as far as that particular scheme is concerned. I mean, I think the little bit that perhaps didn't receive enough attention in the Chancellor's speech is when he said, and I quote, "It's possible to make economies in the employment programme." And I think the overall figures, when we see them, will show, in fact, that spending's been cut in this area overall. And I expect the Training for Work scheme to get hammered when the Secretary of State for Employment gets up. So overall, I think it's a missed opportunity. There was a chance to inject some jobs into what is a jobless growth period we're going through at the moment. And we're seeing a lot of growth of insecurity, a lot of growth of low pay, as the low pay unit was saying. And I think that's what we're going to see more of. More low-grade jobs, low-skilled jobs as the economy strengthens.
And are you saying that it won't get people into jobs who aren't? I mean, the measures on national insurance, for instance, which I thought you were arguing for before the budget statement.
I certainly favour the kind of scheme for national insurance that the Chancellor talked about, but why is it not going to come until 1996, which is a long way off? I'd like to see something that's quick active and that actually accelerates the process of getting people back into the world of work. And I suspect there's quite a lot of sleight of hand in this particular area. Lots of little schemes with limited effect. The overall impact, I think, will probably be more negative than positive.
When we get the fine print.
there's going to be a lot of devil in this particular detail.
Gavin Davis from the City at Goldman Sachs. Gavin, good afternoon. Thanks for joining us. Now, you've had a brief chance to digest all this. What is the City's reaction going to be to a budget that seems full of detail on the employment front and various other fronts, but with no major change in strategy? Do you see it like that, or do you see it differently?
Yeah, this was a budget which came in between last year's budget and next year's budget. Both of those are important, but this was not an important package. I think the City is going to see this as an entirely discounted budget. In other words, they fully expected all of the measures in the budget. The Chancellor at the end of the speech made great play of his cuts in public spending and government borrowing, but they are not going to, those cuts are not going to impress anybody here because they're all entirely the effect of what's happened in the economy in the last 12 months. So nothing much has changed in this speech. The focus now is on when and how much base rates will go up.
So in terms of the City and finance and British, the standing of the British economy and sterling and all the rest of it, are you reasonably optimistic about the way things are going?
Well, I think we've had a very good 1994. I'm very happy that we've had such a rapid rate of growth in 1994 because we've been coming out of a good recession. But I think I take a slightly different view of 1995 from what Peter Jay has been saying earlier. I think the growth of the economy is now becoming rather dangerously rapid. And on all past performance, we will sooner or later get inflation if this growth rate is maintained. Now, I think the real constraint on the Chancellor cutting taxes next year is nothing to do with the PSPR. The PSPR is going to come down rapidly, as he says. The question is going to be, is the economy growing too fast for him to be able to afford to cut taxes, regardless of the PSPR? And if he wishes to address that problem, I think he will need to increase interest rates now, slow the demand growth that we're seeing, and then he'll be able to get the tax cuts in a year's time. But without interest rate increases, I don't think he will.
Gavin, thank you very much indeed. Now let's go down to Bristol, to the RAC headquarters, which we saw briefly but haven't heard from yet. And down there, David Worsket, of the Director of Public Affairs at the RAC, Richard Diamond, Director of the British Road Federation, and Fiona Weir of Friends of the Earth. Could I start with you, Mr. Worsket? What do you make of the changes? Nothing unexpected for you in terms of what was happening to roads?
Well, worse, I think, than expected.
Worse than expected.
I mean, it is. I think I would characterize it as a cul-de-sac with a concrete barrier at the end of it as far as the motorist and transport in general is concerned. And after all, we have further increases in motoring taxation, and we have huge sums, really, another 10% or so out of investment in transport infrastructure. And I recollect only 11 months ago being told that the roads programme, for example, had been prioritised and every scheme left in it was essential. So what's happened to those essential schemes?
Fiona Weir, what do you make of it? Are you pleased by the measures that were announced, both on road transport, but also on landfill and all the rest of it?
Well, on landfill, briefly, it's been too cheap for too long to put waste into holes in the ground. So we're glad to see the costs going up, but it is absolutely crucial that this is extended to incineration. And we did want a levy, not a tax, so that the money could be used to promote markets for recycling. That would have been a much better environmental measure. On transport, we were looking for a really serious policy shift away from environmentally damaging roads towards investment in public transport. And what we got was a budget that hacked a lot of each of those headings. The Chancellor donned the green hat very briefly to justify fuel price increases that will rake in more than $1 billion to Treasury coffers. But I'm afraid he left public transport with a very raw deal in terms of the money that was ploughed back. And we can't say too strongly the motorist needs to be given alternatives to the car.
Fiona Weir, thank you very much. Richard Diamond, the Director of the British Road Federation. There seem to be measures to help the industrial use of the roads, which may have pleased you. But what about the overall position?
I think it's very bad news. It looks like the government had locked something over £1 billion off the transport budget for next year. And that's going to mean there's a lot less work available for civil engineering.
The private sector is meant to be moving in, according to the Chancellor, to help build roads.
I think the Chancellor is making some very optimistic assumptions about how much private sector money will come in. And of course, the private sector initiative was originally thought of as a way of supplementing government investment in transport infrastructure. We're seeing today the governments are relying on it as a substitute for that, and that can't be good for the long-term future of the country. I think there'll be a lot of communities up and down the country today which are going to have bad news. They're going to have much longer waits for bypasses, for instance, to be built. And I think this is a a transport plan which looks very short term and certainly isn't planning the transport infrastructure our economy needs if it's going to be a success in the long term.
Okay, thank you very much, Richard Diamond. Let's go to Dudley West and just get a reaction from our two businessmen, David Williams-Thomas and Roger Hutt, there to the budget. David Williams-Thomas, what do you make of it?
Well, I think it's largely as we expected, David. It's what most of us is expected to see. I think in the Midlands we'll be glad to see the transitional relief on the rate increases that we were expecting, and that is certainly helpful. I'm also pleased to see the help that the Chancellor is giving towards bringing funds into unquoted businesses. I think that that could also be helpful in a small way to many businesses such as ours in the future.
Thank you very much. And your colleague beside you, Mr. Hutt, what do you think?
I listened to the NI proposals. I don't think that they're going to create jobs that are not there in the first place. I remain an old Keynesian. I would like to see a dose of public works, national water grid, something of that order to regenerate the economy from within. I haven't seen anything that I think is going to save Dudley West.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Mr. Hutt. Now, Peter, let's have a look at how this budget is going to affect families.
Right. Now, David, we've already described the small direct tax giveaway the Chancellor's made in this budget, less than £1 a week for everybody. He's also taken some back in indirect taxes, but don't forget there's £3 billion of tax increases in the pipeline for next April. So what's going to be the overall effect on people in the coming financial year, bearing in mind that mortgage relief goes down in value, married couples allowance goes down in value, and there'll be value-added tax on fuel. So let's go now into our typical British town and look at how people will be affected. Bear in mind now that there is indirect taxation going up. There is direct taxation on the one hand going down in this budget, but going up, of course, in April because of those changes in the couple's allowance. Now, here is the unemployed couple down at the end of town in the council house. Direct tax change on the effect on them, 45 pence increase. That's because of the compensation that they're going to be allowed for value-added tax on fuel. Indirect taxation, minus 1.35. They're worse off by £1.35 a week because they smoke and drink a little. We've assumed a sort of shopping basket for each couple here. Worse off then by 90 pence as a result of all the Conservatives' tax changes for the year ahead. Here now is the pensioner couple on £7,000 a year. They are better off by 70 pence a week. That's because of the compensation arrangements for VAT on fuel. Indirect tax makes them worse off by £1.06. Again, they drink and smoke a bit. Worse off by 36 pence a week. And now we move on to the family who live in a private terrace house. They've got a small mortgage. They too drink and smoke a bit. Of course, the drink tax has remained the same, but they smoke. Direct tax down 25, £2.50 worse off. Indirect tax makes them worse off by £1.84. The overall effect on them is they're £4.34 worse off each week. And now we move on to look at the family on average earnings, round about £17,000 a year, up the road in a semi-detached house. They drive a car, £17,000 a year family, £3.27 worse off by £2.35 because of indirect taxation, a total of £5.62 worse off each week. And we move on now to the £30,000 a year family in the rather smarter detached house up the road, something like 50 litres of petrol a week, £3.04 worse off because of the direct tax changes coming up in April. Indirect tax makes them £2.87 worse off, so £5.91 worse off that family on 30,000 a year. Now let's go round the corner to the really well-off family living in the manor house, the £100,000 a year couple. And what's going to happen to them? Well, they're going to, of course, gain a bit from the direct tax changes in this budget, but they'll be worse off because of the other changes in the married couples allowance, down 34 a week. They're going to be worse off by £3.04 a week. Indirect tax makes them worse off by £5.18. They probably use about 100 litres of fuel a week. They drink the 3 bottles of wine and so on, £5.18. £8.22 worse off. So there's the picture. Everybody, on the whole, a little bit worse off in spite of all those extra compensation payments for VAT and so on. That's really because of the direct tax changes coming in and the value-added tax going up in April. David.
Thanks, Peter. Well, it's a great way to win an election, Tony King, isn't it? Everybody's worse off as a result.
At the very beginning of his speech, the Chancellor said we mustn't change our minds now for the sake of short-term popularity, and nobody could possibly accuse him of having tried to do that. I think the reasons Peter's just been giving this is going to play very badly indeed with voters. They are practically going to be squeezed. Practically every person in the country is going to be squeezed. What we have to bear in mind, however, is that this wasn't really the 1994 budget. This was the first installment of the 1996 budget. And we've all been expecting that the Chancellor would, as Peter Jay said a few moments ago, keep his powder dry so that he can blow it up in 1996 in time for a general election victory in 1997.
Well, thanks so much, Tony King. To all of you here on the panel, thank you very much. Those people who joined us from outside in the country, thank them too. And I think perhaps the last word is Gavin Davis, which is this budget is the budget that came between last year's budget and next year's budget. We'll be doing all this again next year, and it'll be a different story perhaps by then. Good afternoon.